Welcome everybody to this first session, early morning session of the second day of the State of the Union, hosted here at the European University Institute. I'm Andrea Calderaro, I'm a reader in International Relations at Cardiff University, and I'm a fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. I have the honor and the pleasure to moderate and chair this session entitled Tech Diplomacy, International Cooperation for Sustainable Digital Transition. And I share this pleasure with Martina Ferracane, that is Associate Professor in Digital Trade at TCD University and also part-time professor here at the European University Institute. Welcome also to the outstanding line of speakers that are here with us today. Some of them, they traveled from really far away, so thank you to all of you for being with us here today. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America and the former Dean of Princeton University and former Director of Policy Planning for the US State Department under the Obama presidency. Ursula Owusu-Ekuful, Minister of Communication and Digitalization for the Republic of Ghana. Peter Sorensen, Principal Advisor and Ambassador at Large on Digital Diplomacy at the European Commission. And here next to me, Francesca Bria, member of the European Commission's new European Bauhaus high-level group and former Chief Digital Technology and Innovation Officer for the city of Barcelona. Thank you again to all of you for being with us here today. So, and thank you to the audience, thank you to the online audience. We have a collective effort here today. The idea around this roundtable is to question whether contemporary tools, diplomatic tools, practices, platforms grounded on multilateralism are equipped, are enough, are sufficient to tackle the variety of challenges that fast technological developments constantly pose to contemporary global order. So in order to answer this question, is critical, of course, to think the transnational nature of the connectivity infrastructure and the transnational nature of innovation. The internet connectivity that our global order so much relies on is a transnational infrastructure because it's made of internet submarine cables laying on the seabed of international sea waters and connect regions, countries, and mostly even more important, cloud services owned by industry distributed worldwide. And internet is transnational because of its functioning. The routing of data takes most of the time little care of national borders. They route around the world because of technical protocols negotiated by the technical communities, and most of the times, again, referring to industry. So this simple observation brings us to the attention to two key points. First of all, that states do not have much control over the functioning of the internet so far. And this means that there is a clear need to enhance a transnational governance approach over the functioning of the internet, or digital technology developments in broader terms. And this means that, of course, we need to enhance international cooperation to make that possible. The other point is that it's always important to remind ourselves, especially when it comes to understanding the role of multilateralism in this context, is that states do not own any single aspects of the internet. Everything is in the hands of industry and in some aspects of civil society organization. And this means that a transnational governance approach over the functioning of the internet and, again, of technological developments needs to be inclusive. So this means that we need to find a formal, effective line of dialogues with industry and, again, civil society organizations. Well, this goes clearly in the direction of the need to enhance international cooperation, but it's also true that in recent days, actually, things are going in the opposite direction. There is a state that have been cornered in the technological developments that has happened so far, are increasingly calling for space, increasing their voice, and this goes in the direction of calling for digital sovereignty. So the key question is how these two issues could coexist, whether they coexist at all. And the questions that we are here again today is back to the critical question I asked before, whether diplomatic practices, diplomatic tools, and the multilateral platforms are really sufficient to tackle these challenges. With this, I stop this brief but already too long introduction to this roundtable, I would start to collect the first inputs from the speakers, and then we follow up with two additional round of questions. So thank you all of you again for being with us today. I will start with Anne-Marie, please. The floor is yours. You would like to react about this point?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is still the most beautiful university in the world, or at least that I know of. So let me, I want to just reflect for a minute on the evolution of what we mean by digital diplomacy. Because when I was in the State Department from 2009 to 2011, which is an eon ago in digital time, digital diplomacy meant e-diplomacy, which effectively meant that the State Department had a Twitter account and a Facebook page. Quite seriously, and that was progress, which it was progress, but that's what digital meant. And then you move from that, and really here the Europeans, I think, were the pioneers, to ambassadors to Silicon Valley. So I think the Danes were the first. You essentially had an ambassador to a part of the United States that was responsible for the big tech companies. So that was the next phase, and you're still not really thinking about either the regulation of the digital world or sort of digital diplomacy much more creatively. If you think about it now, it can mean two things, I think does. One is you really are, in a way, ambassadors to the digital world. Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of PayPal and a big AI investor, is giving a speech this morning at the University of Perugia, getting an honorary degree, in which he is describing the internet and the world of AI as cities with billions of people. That this is, as people move online, they are effectively in their own territory, although it's a territory that is still anchored by physical infrastructure. But increasingly, our children probably won't distinguish between the virtual and physical world in the way that we do. I'm glad I won't be around to see that, but I think that's what's coming. So there's sort of ambassadors to the digital world, and then ultimately, now digital diplomacy means the diplomacy that will govern the digital world. So I just wanted to start with that overview. That's 14 years, and it's a dramatic shift. And then just a word on the point about the who and the what. So Ian Bremmer argues precisely because governments do not own any part of the digital world, that you have to have the tech companies at the table. That he talks about the technopolar moment. I understand why he says that. I mean, we don't understand enough even sort of about how it happens, but we also just don't have the power. At the same time, those tech companies do not have the legitimacy that the diplomatic community does. So I would end by pointing out, I think the leading force for regulation of the digital world, particularly AI, is the UN, which is an extraordinary statement. I would never have said that before, but their high-level roundtable on digital, on AI and on the regulation of the digital world includes major tech people, major governments, but ultimately they'll make a set of recommendations that will go to the only really legitimate forum for a global agreement, which will be the UN at the Summit for the Future and at the General Assembly. So I'll stop there. That's a very unusual statement, I think, given where the UN is in the world of conflict, where it's not playing any role. But in this area, I don't know where else we turn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Maria. That's a wonderful really kick-off on the conversation. I would, yes, Ursula, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I couldn't agree with you more, Anne-Marie. Technology has developed largely without regulation. And that's the reason why we've seen so much innovation in this space. But it's gotten to the point where it's becoming scary to see how it is evolving and affecting the lives of everyone. And governments are becoming nervous that, one, they don't have any control over the internet, and rightly so. And so you've seen the extreme where internet shutdowns and locking out access to the internet to whole populations because of misinformation, disinformation, the threat, cybersecurity, and all the other things. So how do we address this space and allow the technology to be used more for the good than for the negative aspects of it? How do we allow the space to foster innovation without stifling it, while allowing some measure of regulation and control? Self-regulation ought to have been the way to go. But if these tech companies are now calling for governments to provide rules for them to operate in, then we have a problem. And I think that's where tech diplomats come in. The International Telecommunications Union, which is part of, but it is a telecommunications union, and it's one of the oldest UN agencies, developed at a time when none of this existed. They've tried to provide some forum within which we can have these conversations, the states, academia, private sector, the tech companies and all of that. But a lot more needs to be done. So when Denmark appointed a tech ambassador, it was an innovation. But increasingly the world is seeing that that may be the way to go. But they were liaising directly with the companies in Silicon Valley. But I think the conversation has gotten to the point where governments need to sit around the table with the tech companies to see what we can do to provide some sanity in this space. I believe it's next week or so, there's, as part of the World Summit of the Information Society meetings ongoing in Geneva, they have an AI for Good conference, and it's been going on for the past 5 years or so. So conversations are developing around it, but the fast pace of development and use of AI particularly, and the dangers that the internet poses for everyone in terms of cybersecurity, have made it imperative for us to hasten the move to have some detailed conversations around how we're going to use these technologies in a sane manner. And it is absolutely essential that same rules are developed for all parts of the world. Our fear is that for those of us in the global south, we're going to be bystanders watching things evolve, largely because all the tech companies are from the West. And they may develop rules for Europe and the Americas without thinking that the same impact will be felt in the global south, in the Africa and the Middle East and other areas like that. So we need to have a seat at the table, particularly even in the development of artificial intelligence, the language models, the inherent biases and all of that. What is being done actively to address those issues? So let me leave it at that point, and then we'll continue the conversation as well. But there are more questions than answers from where we sit.
Fantastic, and I will have more questions to ask you. Definitely that goes exactly in the direction, but definitely thank you already to point out the human rights dimension of the sustainability of connectivity development. So Peter, please, the floor is yours. Denmark has been loaded with a big responsibility when it comes to tech diplomacy, so I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful place. And then state the fact that I'm Danish by birth, but I'm working as a European, so it's not my fault. But true as mentioned already, that Denmark was early out in 2017, appointing what they call a tech ambassador to sitting in Palo Alto. And by now we have 19 EU member states that have appointed what they call digital 19. Or cyber ambassadors. And I'm quite certain that with the trend going on, we will see more in the coming months or perhaps year. But the start-out question was, and never ask a diplomat that, is the structure we have good enough? And the answer is always no. We're always striving to improve on the structures that we are working with. And Maria said, this issue, technology and the digital, has been one of those that has moved with such a speed that whatever structure there was and whatever structure there is, we can always probably find the glass half empty argument for that. That said, I would again as a diplomat say it works. We saw in March how the entire world came together around a resolution on artificial intelligence as only one. I know everybody wants to talk about artificial intelligence, but it's more than that.
Absolutely.
I just say quantum and then we are going again. But in March this year, the world came together in the United Nations, the forum that has issues on other parts, war being one of them, and for Europeans it's very present with what happens in Europe today. But we came together on an AI resolution proposed by the United States, but supported by the entire world. And had you asked us in January whether that would be possible, or actually in December when the resolution was suggested, the answer would have been no, no way. We would never have agreed on that. But we did. Everybody came. It was unanimously, there was no vote. That's how we say it in the UN. No vote means we all agree. And it just underscores that when we have conversations about these things, sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. I was ambassador in Geneva, sitting in the Human Rights Council. I can tell you that many resolutions don't always get unanimous votes, unanimous support, but you keep going, and this is part of the system. The system is there to start moving each other closer and closer, and then we can have the conversation, is that good enough for where we are? For Europeans, of course, we start at home. Many of my colleagues from outside of Europe say you have an easy life because you have a European Commission that looks after the European market. That's what we did. In the context of consumer protection, we looked at artificial intelligence, and we have, since 2018 till today, developed our AI Act, which is the way we want to deal with artificial intelligence when it comes into our European market. It's clear that the experiences we have had from our internal conversations about this, we carry out into the world. And we carried our ideas and principles out into the conversation in the UN. And it worked for us there. Now, we will have the Chinese proposing a resolution. We're negotiating it right now in the UN. Let's see whether that will be unanimous as well. But just to say that when we look at the system, it's imperfect, no doubt about that, but it's the best we have. And for these technologies, we are discussing in the General Assembly context many of them. There are other UN contexts we can get into them, but I just wanted as a starter to say, imperfect system, the best we have, we are using it, and sometimes it delivers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Of course, many more questions will follow. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also great to be here. Maybe I'll open up to two main issues that a little bit problematized, I think, where we are now, and also respond a little bit to what I've heard until now. And maybe just because also of my position, I've been working at various different levels in tech policy for many years, at the city level, national government level, European level, and also very close to civil society groups. I think one main point that I want to put on the table is the question that I think there is a real need to shift the power balance. This was said, I think we are seeing in the digital economy overall, in this point in time, a concentration of industrial power, infrastructure power, social power, and also political power, which I think it's unprecedented in the history of the Industrial Revolution, and maybe also of diplomatic relationships. And I think this goes far beyond because it doesn't mean governing technologies. It goes far beyond. If we look, for example, at what's happening with the chips war, or at what's happening at the infrastructural level, we have seen during the COVID pandemic how digital infrastructures, critical digital infrastructures, are underpinning essential services of society. Healthcare, education, access to basic facilities, to basic services for people. So this is, and also, of course, you touch on the question of democracy, which is a big one, because let's face it, I also sit in the board of the National Italian TV, right? And I've been working a lot on participatory digital democracy in digital technologies. I mean, today we have an oligopoly, like a monopolization of the digital infrastructures. When it comes to civic participation, we have polarization, we have fake news, but this is because of a business model that's based on the manipulation and monetization of personal information and data. Now, we know that, for example, for the GDPR or for the European Commission, this is even non-compliant with our fundamental rights, with our liberal democratic order, I will say. And we are in a year of massive elections everywhere. This is scary. I mean, we have lots of citizens' data in a platform called X, where the main, the head, the CEO of this platform is one of the richest men in the planet, and at the moment is doing campaigns for far-right groups, like actively. I mean, this is scaring me. I mean, this is really scary for me as a European citizen, as a democratic, citizen, to see that this is happening. What do we do about that? So for me, and even I think when I was working in cities, and we will go maybe in the next round, in particular on this, I felt the urgency of rebalance power to say, we want to represent a world where technology serves public needs, protect fundamental rights, and really we are defending the democratic rights of citizens, workers, small businesses, and so on, because this is becoming really urgent. Then the second point I want to pose, and then I stop there, is that I feel that this diplomatic in general, it's not only the tech diplomacy, but I think we are seeing a very different moment in time now. So we are maybe beyond the hyper-globalization, beyond the Washington consensus. We are entering a new phase where I think, of course, because of the multiple crises that we're facing, the so-called poly-crisis, between war and diplomacy, I see that national governments are leveraging economic statecraft in a way that this hasn't happened before. I mean, let's look at, for example, the use of tariffs, the use of sanctions, the use of tech bans, the use of export control, the use of restrictions of technologies. I mean, in particular, of course, key areas. If we look at chips, this is very clear. We also have chips champions actually in Europe, like ASML, and we have seen what has happened when you restrict fundamental components of the global value chain. So obviously, and I would like to hear also the others in the panel here, obviously we are talking about maybe a new Cold War. We have, we have trade tension between the US and China. But for me, because of Andrea started and saying this is a global order, we cannot go into the Cold War mentality again. I think here, Europe has a massive role to play because, for example, with our regulatory framework, we need that this is globally working. And we need that we have accountability, that we have the way to, for example, assess the algorithms of AI complex systems because they affect workers, they affect our daily life, they affect our economy and life as citizens. So I stop here and I say, this is a moment where on one side maybe we're a bit terrified because it's a massive concentration of power, but on the other side is a great opportunity to shape a future world that it's really better for all of us without going back to a Cold War mentality, Cold War in the best possible scenario, because actually we see hot wars happening, that it's really, I think, very much troubling.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Francesca. You touch on so many critical issues, difficult to summarize with one sentence, and I don't want to take too much time, but you clearly have highlighted how we should wonder, it's pretty much linked to what I was saying before, whether the tools that we have adopted so far are sufficient to tackle the contemporary challenges that we are facing because of a variety of issues emerging from digital technology. I would add that Elon Musk, in addition to X, is also the owner of this new satellite network, so there is a lot to say about that. I was talking about internet submarine cables, but we are moving into a new dimension of connectivity and owned by one single person. Anyway, I'll stop here because I have a lot to say myself. So, thank you all of you. I would start with a few more specific questions, benefiting from the outstanding expertise that each of our speakers have to bring to the table. And Anne-Marie, at the last meeting we had in Washington, exactly, was in May, it was a 2 days wonderful event where we covered a variety of issues concerning how international cooperation over this variety of digital technology has evolved over the years. So the impression is that we're still moving in different directions. We are still moving in silos. And this means that there is a clear lack of legitimacy and probably could pose some challenges to the concept of accountability in global politics, something that you've been working extensively for years, really. So the question here is, because of the variety of challenges we are discussing here today, how do you think the concept of accountability, should we still rely on the concept of accountability, or in the context of digital domain, what accountability really means?
Yeah, so thank you. So I think we can think about accountability in a number of different contexts. At the first level, at the ground level, we can do much more to hold tech companies accountable for the tech they develop. So that, for instance, with AI, there's a lot of safety mechanisms, privacy mechanisms, particularly safety, that can be built into the technology itself to make it easier for civil society and governments to actually monitor what happens. So the mechanism of accountability is being able to actually tell whether or not these companies are building in privacy protections and, again, particularly safety protections. I am not skilled enough as a technologist to be able to tell you what those are, but I do know that the technologists I talk to who are really concerned about using AI for good look there first, the level of technological, the safety built into the tech itself, and then equally to make what's happening with that technology more transparent to civil society groups who are the watchdogs, and then to government. So that's one level. The second is, I think it's very important that we think about not just the concentration of power, which I totally agree with, and you might note, Elon Musk is not American originally, right? I mean, many of the people who are working, at least in the American tech companies, they're global. Part of the problem is that we have created a massive brain drain to California from all over the world, but that there is that concentration of power. We need to think about global civil society as the counterweight and connect them much more to, so I was saying to the minister that New America has a partnership with Kwame Nkrumah University. We should be thinking about places like this and places across the world. I don't say the global south anymore, I say the global majority, because that is what it actually is. But thinking about how you create and how you use technology to connect those groups as a counterweight. The third thing I'll say on technology, on accountability, is honestly the progressive groups that I work with often look to the European Union as the group of nations that has the power but less of the concentrated economic interests to think about how do you hold these companies accountable for people. Because in the United States, and particularly with a broken political system, we can't do it. We do not have the ability, given the lobbying power of many of our biggest companies, to actually develop the same kind of, I think, civic-minded and global regulation that the EU does. Now, as I say that, I have many friends in the tech community, and they will disagree with me. And there is lots of competition, and competition with China. But I really do look to the Europeans to be a kind of beacon of accountability that other nations can follow. So in the tech, civil society, and then nations, but you need powerful nations economically who don't have quite the same interests that either China or the US does in supporting their tech companies.
Fantastic, absolutely. And this means also then that the UN, that of course you mentioned
Exactly.
before, needs to be capable to go beyond the classic traditional multilateral platforms that they homed for.
And I should have said, perhaps we could get to a point where it's the EU and the AU.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Anna-Marie. Ursula, so transnational governance approach over a more sustainable digital transformation, as we call it, means that, of course, needs to be inclusive. And this means that we need to be sure that the voices from the global majority, as Anne-Marie was suggesting, are heard. I mean, we need to remind ourselves that 75% of the internet users are actually located in the global south, and this means that it doesn't sound quite good, the fact that there are technologies still led by industry concentrated in a specific country and regulated by a few actors. So it's clear that we need to hear voices that be sure that the functioning of technology reflect the regional needs, priorities. So do you think that the tools that we have so far are sufficiently inclusive, or what is missing to be sure that we're going to really achieve what we want to achieve here?
They're not.
Of course.
And that's the short answer to it. They're not. But I think we once we recognize that there's a challenge, it gives us the opportunity to do something about it. And if you look at the demographic bulge as well, the majority of our countries in Africa has the youngest population on earth, and they are the ones who use this technology the most. So it's important that we include them and hear their voices in this conversation. My fear is that not enough opportunity is being created to have a dialogue along these issues with the parts of the world that could be the answer or who could be part of the problem. And until we are deliberate about including the global majority, and they are indeed, if you look at small island states, Africa, the Middle East, and India, you throw India into the mix, then you have quite a substantial chunk of people whose voices need to be heard. And they are talking amongst themselves. The young people are engaging, but there's a disconnect. We're not listening to them, or we're not hearing them. And my fear is that it may be even too late if they also feel that they're going to go it their own way. And with the power of the tech companies who are directly accessing them and relating to them too, then we may have more of a problem than we think. But identifying it gives us a chance to also engage. And I agree that the EU needs to step up to the plate. And both the EU, the UN, the AU may also be bogged down with bureaucracy. And they do not act as quickly or as timeously as they should. So while they're busy talking and talking, things are happening on the ground. You know, and that's what creates a problem that might be more difficult to control. For those of us in Africa, we've decided that the AU is too slow. And so those who are willing to work towards the digital transformation of the continent have come together in a group called the Smart Africa Alliance, made up of 33 countries who think that we need to speed up our use of technology for the betterment or the development of our economies. And so we learn from each other's experiences and replicate what's working in each other, learning and checking what's not working in each other's economies. And we think that that's also helping us coalesce around issues that are of concern to us while the larger continental body still talks, you know. So if we're not careful, we're going to have smaller groups like these evolving to discuss the issues and to act more quickly to address them, while the larger, more established ones, which have the legitimacy and the power to act, are feeling their way through. But you can't blame them. This fourth industrial revolution, the speed and the pace of this has taken everybody by surprise. And so the time that normally would have had to develop the regulations and the rules guiding its use, we don't have that space to act anymore. And so we also need to develop mechanisms that enable these international organizations which have the legitimacy to also respond quicker to some of these interventions that are taking place all the time. Look at the speed with which AI has now become commonplace. Look at the dangers that cybersecurity poses. Now, we have unmanned aerial warfare, and these drones can be disabled in space. I just got the news that Russia is now putting satellites in space that can be weaponized. We don't know where the end is no longer in sight. We don't know what's going to happen yet. Now, if we haven't even been able to develop rules for cybersecurity, which affect everybody, it's transnational, when are we going to get a handle on these evolving, emerging technologies and start dealing with them? My fear is that the genie has already left the bottle, and we're trying to close it, but we still need to find a way to put it back so that we would create a safer world for all of us. The pace at which we're going. A few months ago, there were multiple cyber cuts, subsea cable cuts, which shut off East Africa and West Africa at the same time. And nobody knows how that happened, because it's never happened before. Who was responsible for it? There are all kinds of suspicions out there, but I'm not going to go in that space.
That is a super important point. Ursula, thanks so much. And Peter, I mean, Ursula has put a lot of attention again on you, I mean, on the role of the European Union.
We're leaving
So
it to you.
I will please remind now to be very, very short with our answers. We want to be sure to have the time to discuss with the audience here. So that's correct. I mean, it's been mentioned that policy making usually, I mean, technology evolves faster than the policy making capacity to act. That's pretty much true. So the impression is that with the tech diplomacy, it's a way for states to bridge this gap, go straight to the Silicon Valley, trying to enhance this dialogue, or be there when technology evolves. So, but it's not a way to compromise the regulatory and policy-making prerogative of sovereign state by establishing this tech consulate straight in the Silicon Valley. Please, short answers.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that is a difficult one in a short answer.
I know, but that's the format we have to operate.
I will try. I mean, we established our office in Silicon Valley exactly to have this conversation with the industry. But it's clear, we know that industry is not enough. It's key to have industry at the table. You can't discuss this. I mean, not even the industry knows why the AI does what it does. So how should we? So therefore, we need to have those who know and who produce and put the equipment be there. But I think it's important for us, and that's why we have been the staunch defenders of the multi-stakeholder process for the internet governance, that we have built into our way of doing legislation, that we have the engagement of civil society, of academia, and so on. but also that once we have developed our legislation, we build partnerships. I mean, that's the key thing that we do. So I'm sorry we don't have the times, but I would like to tell you about our global gateway, why we're doing it, how we are building human-centric technologies and so on. But we can perhaps come back to that later on.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for staying within the time. Absolutely. I know, frustrating. Well, Francesca, I mean, you've been playing, in your role as a city councillor of Barcelona. I remember when you were in this role, you were sharing with me some anecdotes about the challenges for you to negotiate with industry while taking the opportunity the industry could offer to city, but at the same time be sure that citizens could keep ownership of their own data. So you act like a diplomat. So if you can share a bit of what are the main challenges?
Maybe we have to be brief. So a couple of things. For me, it's very important to convey the message that when we talk about technological sovereignty, it's not only state sovereignty. I mean, this was also said before. Working at a city level, I think cities actually are a very important diplomatic actor because they are, a lot of the tech impact we see on cities. I mean, think about platform economy, the platformization of the economy, the kind of housing model, the transportation changes, everything we see on cities which affect directly the life of citizens. And also cities are really in proximity with citizens, and I think it's absolutely critical to convey the message that this is not a topic that you only have to discuss with the tech experts. It goes beyond the technology. As I said before, algorithmic management affect the workplace. It affects your wage, your rights as a citizen. It has a huge implication. If we can't control the data, that was the question for me to pose the question of data sovereignty, data democracy, because it was very clear. I was a CTO collaborating with CTOs all around the world. For me, having access to data as a common good, as a public infrastructure, it was critical to, for example, solve climate change. We had to measure pollution, we had to measure sustainability in the mobility, the environment, and so on. Public interest technologies is fundamental to take better decisions for everyone. So these are topics really that go beyond only, state competition in that sense, and I think this is absolutely important to understand. Then maybe the other question of, I think I want to pose maybe one thing very important for me. Regulation is absolutely critical, and yes, we continue to say, okay, this has to go beyond US and China competition and have different actors and also civil society involved. And the EU, when it comes to regulatory, the big regulator of the digital age, I think we've done a good job. We have to say it. It's good. But at the same time, I'm really convinced, and now we see also a coming back of industrial policy, a coming back, as I said before, of a lot of other different tools, investment in infrastructure. Regulation is not enough. And I would advocate that also cooperation should be, for example, about building alternatives. Because we do need, and it's true, we have to talk to the industry. Of course we have to talk to the industry. But at the same time, digital public infrastructures are key. And when it comes to digital public infrastructures, let's also think about, for example, the Indian case, which would be different from what the EU has done because the EU has a different regulation. For example, for us, centralizing data in the power of, state control or a centralized entity is not good. Like, we care about the privacy and the information self-determination of people and our fundamental rights. So it won't be the same way. But I think when it comes to the control of data, digital identity, payment system, and basic digital public infrastructures, we can collaborate also with the UN, also with Global South or the global majority to have more democratic control. And this is not going to run by the big tech. Europe has to be very clear there. It cannot be run by the big tech because this is fundamental to a sustainable, resilient, democratic society. So I'm afraid, I want to say, let's go also beyond regulating big tech. Let's build alternatives. And these alternatives are for the public interest.
Yeah. Super.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It seems that everybody agree on that,
Yeah.
but for sure we're going to have space for continue this conversation. I'll leave the floor to Martina. Thank you, Martina, for following up.
Thanks. Well, I have a round of questions for each of you, which are more from a regional perspective. And I will start with Anne-Marie talking about the US, and in particular about data governance, which is one of the issues more hotly discussed, and because it is at the intersection between privacy, security, also trade. The US has historically been an advocate of free flow of data across the globe because of economic prosperity, but also because of freedom of expression, freedom of access to communication. And now we are seeing a change of direction in US policy, both in trade discussions, because the US has withdrawn its proposals on free flow of data in trade agreements, but also domestically with all these new policies which are aiming at restricting some data going to China or Russia. Which is exactly what the US has been fighting over the past decade or two when it comes to China. So what do you think about this, and what do you think that means for the future of transnational governance for data?
So I'm going to start just by saying I couldn't agree more with the role of cities. And I think that is also a place where you can really mobilize power. I mean, if you think about the billions of people who live in cities, so just underline that. We are seeing a dangerous combination of, on the one hand, the US government and the tech companies are aligned on the US-China competition for very different reasons, right? From the the government point of view, there really is real fear about where China is heading. The China of today is not the China of the early Obama administration when I served, even all the way through. I mean, when Obama talked about a pivot to Asia, he was thinking much more about cooperation and engagement. But then by 2015, 2016, and as she sort of consolidated power, we are now in a I hope not a new Cold War, and not because we're so connected, but a dangerous time. At the same time, the tech companies benefit from this because it's the way they fight regulation. Because you can't regulate us in AI because China's not being regulated, and that we are the big players. And so there's a kind of unholy alliance there where you get it's easy to get things through Congress if it's anti-China, and you also get the support of the tech companies. Where this now is, I think, going to differ is this sudden regulation. The US has never regulated the flow of data, and we are now beginning to. And, you know, Jake Sullivan says it's a small fence, a small yard with a high fence, but it's still, it's setting a precedent for countries that have been for the free and open internet that I do find very worrying. I also find it's very hard for civil society to understand it enough to actually be able to push. So I don't have an answer except to say that the dynamics are not good. This may also, though, be a place where Africa and India and Brazil can play more of a role, sort of insisting that they not have to choose between India and China, and the EU as well. But it's tricky.
Thanks. You were talking also about Africa, and I would like to move to Ursula. In Africa, as you were also mentioning, there are regional discussions on digital standards. One of the discussions is taking place in the context of the African Free Trade Continental Area, and the discussions which are going on in these months on the digital protocol, where there is discussion on free flow of data, but also access to source code and others. Do you think that initiatives like this can play a role in creating one voice for Africa and then enabling the continent to have more, a stronger voice also in the international context when it comes to digital standards?
I think it's a good start. One, the Continental Free Trade Area creates the largest economic market, if we can get it to work, and it's a big if. There are challenges, but the recognition has now dawned on everyone that the only way to make it work is to use digital. Digital is the only way to connect the platforms. But then you have 54 countries with different when we talk about Africa, people think it's a homogeneous continent. It's not. 54 different countries with different rules, languages, systems, who find it difficult to even trade amongst themselves. And we think that this is the vehicle to use to forge closer integration on the continent. Before we broke up into nation states, we had trade amongst ourselves for millennia. And I said that the trans-Saharan trade route has been there for millennia. Somehow, when we broke up into individual countries, we find it difficult to even interact amongst ourselves. And so using digital technology is the best way for us to forge real integration and to have a voice and a seat at the table. There's a lot of discussions going on about even linking up our systems with that of India. And I agree with you. We shouldn't be forced to choose between either the US or China. And we're being put in that uncomfortable position. And so we've had cause to tell them that, look, from where we sit, China provides us with the most affordable technology. You're asking us not to deal with them. What's the alternative that you're providing? And we're not hearing anything. And so we've decided that we'll do what's in our best interests. While you fight your little battles, we'll focus on doing what's in our best interest. And that's why we're working on the Continental Free Trade Area and linking up with other blocks. Like I'm on my way to India from here to have conversations about how we can work with them to develop our 5G infrastructure. We're not doing Europe or we're not doing China, we're going to India. And so we'll forge our own partnerships. And we do need to collaborate a lot more because we need each other in this space. And that's the belated recognition that Africa is now getting, that we will sink or swim together. And so we're using these digital tools and the digital protocol to break down the barriers that have kept us apart for so long.
Thank you. Well, I move now to Peter, and I want to ask you about generally the coherence of EU policy on tech diplomacy, because there are different venues where these things have been discussed. You have the digital diplomats, the tech diplomats in the US, but also there is discussions on this in the WTO in a trade context, also plenty of rules domestically being implemented for enhancing EU digital sovereignty. So how do you reconcile all the different policies and approaches to make sure that there is digital sovereignty, but at the same time the EU remains connected and engaged with the global community?
Thanks. You've all been very kind to the European Union, so I will have to praise us on one thing, and that is we're actually trying to make sure that the coherence, I mean, the way we work, the way we develop our policies, the way we secure that what happens in trade is what we do on the digital diplomacy, is probably best described by the fact that our ambassador in the WTO is referring to the same people as I do, so there's coordination there. But you're right, there are many venues. I mean, what we've been discussing today on cyber, hybrid warfare, connectivity, the infrastructure, conversations in the UN, links into what happens in the trade. It's, so how do you balance that? I will only blow our trumpet so far to say, I think nobody's doing it better than we do. Taking into consideration, we're 27 doing it. We're not one, we're 27. But it's clear that it is the challenge. How do you? I mean, this moves so fast. It permeates every single policy area. It is much broader than climate change in terms of how to work. Climate change is easy. It's difficult, but it's easy to work with. This is much more unwieldy, and therefore, as I started out by saying, if you ask us, is the system perfect? I would say, no, it's not, but it's best we have it, we're working with it. But your question is a good one. Can I just add to the two previous ones? I gave away my minutes, so I'll just grab one back and say that I fully agree with the cities. That is, we agree with that. We also make sure that we have the stakeholders and cities involved. I fully agree with the digital public infrastructure. This is why we are designing our global gateway projects the way we are, exactly for that. I am slightly more optimistic on the conversation, but it has taken time. I mean, again, as you said, it is very early days. We had the platform in the 10s. We realized they can do something to our societies and our democracy we don't like, therefore we need to look into it. We need privacy. We have privacy laws in Europe. Others have been inspired. It's very, very good. But where we come, and what we did was, we started talking in smaller groups, G7, OECD, Council of Europe, with ourselves. But 2024 is the year where we really have broadened it out, because the UN's Pact of the Future has an annex that will be the Global Digital Compact. And some of the things we talked about, and you rightfully called for, that we need to have a conversation about, data included, is in there. So we are sitting at the cusp of this conversation just starting. So I think if we had this conversation next year, we will have much more concrete stuff to talk about in that respect, because the international universal conversation about this has just started. So that's a positive thing, I think.
Thanks. Well, and Francesca, following on this question on your previous comment about EU policy and the effectiveness, you say that so far we have been successful in regulating the digital economy, and you also talked about more to do, right?
Yes.
To also have a more democratic control on the digital transformation. So what do you think the EU has done already that is successful, and what you think could be done to be more successful?
So since we only have, I think, a couple of minutes, can I contradict the common sense here just another time? No, because I mean, it's very, now this is going to be a bit funny that I'm the one having to actually defend the Biden administration and their work on these topics, but I don't feel, I mean, I feel that, for example, what Lina Khan is doing in the Competition Authority and antitrust, this is massively helpful, and I think actually on that terrain with Europe, we have to find much more collaboration. I also think that Ambassador Tai, when she talked about, you know, the danger of data monopolization and the question of extreme secrecy on source code and algorithms, this is not good for democracy. I mean, I'm sorry. It's like when we say free flow of data, we don't mean data amassed by 3 corporations in the planet, which then are using this data to feed the AI systems that we don't understand and we don't control. This is a massive problem. So, you know, the fact that the US, I mean, that the digital trade rules in the Trump era are being reversed by this administration on this line, I see this is actually good, and it is probably also an impact of, you know, what the EU is doing, what, you know, other countries are doing, because I think, you know, we understand we need more justice in this space, and there is less. So I just wanted to say that, yes, I think what we are doing more is we definitely need collaboration. Europe, of course, need to also, we can't just regulate, but then ask the big tech of other countries to please enforce. If we want to enforce, we need to have our own technologies and capabilities. And maybe, yes, let me end this because we haven't talked about it. Capabilities and education. I know, Andrea, that this is a lot of your work. For me, you know, at the end of the day, and when I was working in cities, I was always saying technology is about organizational change, is about skills, capabilities, working differently. This is a important part of the picture. So I think this kind of alliances to create capabilities, education, skills, and our capacity, yes, to reclaim democratic control of digital infrastructure and data for humanity and the planet. I think this is really important for the future. So I'm going to end with a positive note here.
It's very positive.
Yes. Excellent.
Utopian almost, I would say. But thank you for touching also on this concept of capacity, which is something actually that is so critical, so critical. Capacity to engage into this conversation from a variety of angles. Variety of actors needs to engage into this, otherwise we keep talking about being inclusive, multi-stakeholder in civil society, but probably there is still too much little understanding on how to engage in these processes. So I mean, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as probably we did, or at least I did so far. But now is open for questions, also from the online community. Yes, I'll collect 3 first round of questions. Please, 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 short questions, short answers. Thank you. Okay, so we have the 3 ones are 1, 2, yes, and 3. Fantastic. And then we have a second round. Please.
Very short. Regulation is fine, cooperation, going to the bureaucracy and going beyond regulation. But what about the ownership of all this? The infrastructure is owned by these big technical companies. So sitting around the table, even going to the bureaucracy, even making an alternative, won't help the ownership. What about this new power balance as all these people, these companies, occupy, they own the cables going under the sea?
Fantastic, thanks so much.
That's a good point.
Yeah, second question, please. Even shorter if you can make it. I know it's horrible,
Yes,
but
so
that's...
this is a question for Peter about a digital partnership. We have seen 4 that the EU has done. Now there is more talk about involving the Balkans, involving Latin America, involving African countries. How does this square with the not choosing between the West and China?
Fantastic, thank you. And last question, this first round of questions, please.
Yes, thanks very much. I want to ask a question about spectrum. Sorry to be boring with spectrum, but it's super important. I suspect almost everyone here is using Wi-Fi, and most of you know that in order to have access to Wi-Fi, you need access to spectrum. This is usually managed by national governments, and so it's super important to make sure that all technologies have access to this. So I wanted to ask you about how you see a good management of this, but usually nationally controlled resource.
Is there somebody that would like you to answer this question, or all of them? All of them, probably we won't have the time, so somebody needs to pick each of these questions. So please, the first question is about the regulation, and we can follow up on that. And is there somebody that you were asking the questions to? Specific or?
It's about ownership.
Ownership, yeah.
Ownership of infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, I can maybe start and then you, okay, so this is very complex. I think, you know, the complexity of the stack, of the infrastructure, it's very high when it comes to ownership. So I think we have to make some decisions, at least, of where it is important to claim back ownership. For example, I mean, in my work, I mean, now a long time, I'm advocating at the data layer to have much more democratic control, which doesn't mean the states owning the data, and I want to be very clear here because I am in favor of privacy-preserving technologies and rights-preserving technologies. So I think we need a new, different model of governance where the states maybe own part of the infrastructure, but then the data is kept in a data intermediary or a data trust, which is governed in the public interest, privacy-preserving with encryption as a fundamental right, and this is a new model and it can be also decentralized. So it doesn't have to be state-controlled. So I think I just want to answer because then, okay, you have the cables, you have the satellite, you have the cloud, where, for example, Europe is trying, you know, with Gaia X and a lot of other initiatives at the chips level, at the cloud level. You know, we understood we have basically nothing which is European at this point, and this is, I mean, undermining also our business, I mean, our SMEs, our workers, our citizens. So we are trying to have digital industrial policy. I think it will be much stronger in the next EU mandate, I hope so, and part of it should be public digital infrastructures. So publicly owned. I finish by saying this hybrid model, you know, like BBC way, the BBC, you remember, the next generation, the next public service. So can be publicly funded with some public governance, but not state control. It can be independently controlled. I think here we have the possibility to put forward new ownership models, yes, at the level of AI and data, and maybe also at the level of the digital services. Then there are tough things like the sea cables, and yes, of course, this is very tough, or the cloud, or the, yeah? So, okay, I stop
Fantastic.
here. Yeah. Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm really working for that. So if you're interested, I mean, this is really one of my key topics.
Definitely, that's why you're here, Francesca. So, who'd like to pick the Federica, right? Federica question. It was Peter, right?
Peter.
Yeah,
Please, Peter.
The digital partnerships,
Yeah.
is that a choice in that? That's not how we see it insofar that the partnerships that we are making we have to look into, I mean, we have made the AI, let's take the AI as an example. AI Act, it's a consumer protection exercise that we have done internally. And we have done our GDPR, our data protection exercise as well. When we do the partnerships, it's mainly on request also that they're interested in hearing how we are doing it, how we're doing it to govern our market. That is not as much as a squeeze between China and the US, so we don't see it that way. It hasn't come up, and maybe from the outside it can be seen like that, but that's not how it is. So partnership is really on demand. It is where we have a common interest. It is mainly where our partners are interested in how we have governed our space. So that is, it's not a one way, but it's a lot of sort of experience sharing that is coming out in these partnerships. So that's how we're doing it. We are open for partnerships, so it's not we have chosen, it's sort of whom have been interested in doing it with us for now. And I see much more to come.
I'll attempt an answer for the spectrum question and share a few of our experiences along the way. We started by selling spectrum because it's a resource and it was a good way for governments to earn revenue. So you auction it. But we've come to the realization that that may not be the best way to go. And so we're giving it to a neutral infrastructure company to develop shared infrastructure for all the companies to use. We've mandated technology neutrality as well. So you can utilize whatever technology on the available spectrum that you have to enable us maximize the usage of it and extend connectivity to all parts of the country. So for us, we're trying to see if this model also works. And it has to be a public-private partnership. So government is throwing in the spectrum into the infrastructure while the private partners are also utilizing it to build out the infrastructure for the use of our citizens.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I massive apologize for the questions. We have strict time. I feel that I failed in my role of being strict with mine. I'm joking. But I really hope, again, I'm not sure whether we really found a new solution for multilateralism versus other models, but I think it was a good time here to unpack the concept. It's clear that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the next couple of years. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for again our speakers. Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you.
We've done well. Oh, pleasure to meet you.
Hello and welcome to the 2024 State of the Union organized by the European University Institute here in Florence. I'm Benedicta Marzinotto, Jamonet Fellow at the Schumann Center, and delighted to introduce the panel on new modes of European macroeconomic governance. There was a previous session on the new policy mix. What we're trying to do here is to go beyond the policy mix and maybe indulge on creative institutional arrangements that are needed to deliver that policy mix. So that's the mission here. Let me introduce the speakers in the order in which they will speak today. Pierre Gramegna, Managing Director of the European Stability Mechanism. Laurence Beaune, she's joining us remotely. She'll be online pretty soon. Former Secretary of State for European Affairs, French Republic. Declan Costello, Deputy Director General, DG ECFIN, European Commission. Atanas Pekanov, he's an economist right now at the Austrian Institute of Economic Research and was former Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Bulgaria. The panel is organized as follows. There will be an opening speech by Mr. Gramegna, who is going to provide us with an overview of the reforms that were undertaken in the last decade, possibly hinting at future challenges, after which I'll start the first round of questions. So Pierre, maybe you can join the podium.
Thank you.
You'll have 10 minutes for your presentation and then follow up debate.
Thank you very much for having invited me to this event. It's an honor and privilege to be part of this conference and to be in Fiesole, which is one of the main Etruscan cities that has left a mark in history. Being in Tuscany, country of Renaissance, we are reminded how in this place we saw emerge creativity based also on past traditions and glories. And it is probably an ideal place to reignite a spirit of adventure, a spirit of innovation and boldness, which we need today in Europe. Reflecting, as you have suggested, a little bit on the past 15 years, it is undeniable that both the euro area and the EU have made significant strides in bolstering their resilience. As Jean Monnet predicted, Europe has been forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions found. The challenges posed by the great financial and the euro sovereign debt crisis laid bare substantial vulnerabilities in the European architecture. But these crises were not wasted, as Europe has reinforced its institutional setup with the creation of the European Stability Mechanism, with the strengthened Stability and Growth Pact, and by deciding to establish a banking union. These considerable reforms help preserve the integrity of the euro area. Today, our banks are more resilient than in the past, and this was last tested when there were financial turbulences in Switzerland and in the United States, which had very little spillover effects on the EU. The pandemic, which caused both horrible human and economic havoc, was also met with remarkable European responses. The unexpected and external shock demonstrated the importance and effectiveness of rapid and well-coordinated European cooperation at both national and European levels. Most importantly, this pandemic showed that Europe is capable of unprecedented solidarity. The program Next Generation EU, which must be very, very popular and famous in Italy, best exemplifies that. It was created to support Europe's economic recovery from the pandemic, and it would also help member states finance the transition to greener and more digital economies. Besides, it is worthwhile underlining that a large part of the program, nearly half of it, is in grants and the other half in loans. If you had asked me before the pandemic if Europe would be capable of such solidarity, I would have been skeptical. And this, despite my deep-rooted optimism. Supplementary measures were taken also in that context of the pandemic. The European Commission, the European Investment Bank, and the European Stability Mechanism created instruments to support workers, businesses, and sovereigns, which were decided during a very long night in the Eurogroup and ECOFIN of the 9th of April 2020, which I attended. Even as the pandemic was fading, Europe faced another shock. Since Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine in February 2022, another human tragedy has been unfolding before our eyes. But in the face of adversity, Europe's response was again steadfast. more than 50 billion euro were mobilized in the existent EU budget to support Ukraine. Member states provided fiscal support to their citizens and enterprises to shield them from the higher energy prices. The Repower EU program helped diversify energy supplies away from Russia's gas. Resolute monetary policy by the European Central Bank has been implemented to bring down excessive inflation, boosted because of disrupted supply chains and higher energy prices. Once more, Europe has proven more resilient than many expected, in line with Jean Monnet's say. Now Europe is at a new crossroad. It is confronted with major short and longer-term challenges. First and foremost, the war in Ukraine, defense and security issues, geo-economic fragmentation, climate change, and aging population. According to Mario Draghi, an additional 500 billion euro per year are necessary to close the investment gap. The key question that arises is, where will these financial resources come from? Especially as fiscal consolidation is warranted. The new fiscal framework of the European Union will provide space for reforms and investment. It will be more growth-friendly, which is positive, and a lesson learned from the previous pact. But fiscal consolidation will be necessary to ensure that public debt remains sustainable. Consolidating public finances is also necessary to ensure buffers in case of future crisis. Against this backdrop, there has been lots of ideas launched for additional common financing at European level. There have been several calls to issue European defense bonds. President Macron, in his latest Sorbonne speech, suggested the use of European stability mechanisms to finance investments. Enrico Letta, in his report called Much More Than a Market, suggests that the ESM could establish a credit line to help its member countries finance their defense and security expenditures. The same report also recommends marketing safe assets of EU institutions under the same name to create a common European safe asset. Other calls, finally, have been made to create a central fiscal capacity. I think that focusing more on EU-level financing is now unavoidable. Allow me to focus here on three main items, and that will be the conclusion of my speech. First, on what has already been achieved. Indeed, recent history has shown that funding through European institutions has yielded positive results. European safe assets, constituted by the issuances of the European Commission for the NGEU program, the European Investment Bank, and the ESM, recently broke in total the 1 trillion mark. So before thinking about new forms of common financing, I believe we should keep in mind the existing lending capacity. There are still capacities left in the NGEU program, and the ESM has a current lending capacity of 422 billion euro. As ESM, we stand ready to support members within our mandate, and that mandate is to ensure financial stability. Second, very important is private investment. Public support and public investment will not be sufficient to cope with all these challenges. We need to crowd in the private sector through private investment. When Mario Draghi talks about 500 billion per year necessary for the coming challenges, he assumes that more than 2/3 of this must come from the private sector, and he's completely right, although the exact number of how much and what to share is difficult to judge. Therefore, it is urgent to progress on the Capital Markets Union. The Eurogroup has recently agreed on the roadmap to achieve this in the aftermath of the European elections. And sitting around the table of the Eurogroup, I could see how difficult, but also how important this challenge is and how necessary it is to trigger the necessary flow of investment. Thirdly and last, there is another key variable that I must underline and which helps us solve the equation, that is economic growth. Europe has less growth than the United States since many years. As I speak, it is less than half. So, besides structural reforms at national level, we need to focus more on the European single market. Created more than 3 years ago, it is a success story. It needs to be made more operational and to be modernized. We need a single market 2.0. Unlocking its full potential would foster economic growth and raise citizens' welfare over the long term, as Enrico Letta has highlighted in his excellent report. Let me conclude with a quote by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the past illustrious residents of Florence. I quote, "I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do." Thank you.
Thank you. Join us to continue the conversation. Now, there's a common theme in the State of the Union, which is the large investment gap and the recognition that there is some need of EU-level funding. But I would like to take a step backwards, since the Commission, the Council approved on the 30th of April a new economic governance framework that is revising the Stability Pact, and we would like actually to know a bit more about the details. What are the novelties on paper? Declan, it's a question directed to you. And what are we likely to see in practice that is different from the past? I would like you to indulge a bit on the implementation phase, meaning is really the space for public investment fully constrained or not? What kind of investment is the new governance framework likely to deliver?
So thank you very much. And indeed, the new economic governance framework entered into force just over 3 weeks ago on the 30th of April. And it was a big achievement to get that piece of legislation adopted under the current mandate. And 4 weeks from now, literally to the day, we will be taking the first formal steps in the new procedure. The Commission will be opening or recommending or presenting its suggestions on the existence or not of excessive deficits. And 2 days later, we will be sending to member states what we call technical trajectories, our estimates of the fiscal consolidation path, which are compliant or consistent with what is agreed in the new framework. So it's 4 weeks from now it kicks off in a real sense. Let me comment on a few features which are different and how I see, let's say, potential implementation issues. Look, one of the biggest features of the new framework is it provides for a more gradual fiscal consolidation path, especially for the countries with the greatest fiscal sustainability challenges. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, a welcome development because it will avoid unnecessarily abrupt impacts of fiscal consolidation on economic activity. It will allow for a proper planning and hopefully protection and even increase in the levels of public investment whilst countries undergo fiscal consolidation. And I think all of this is to be very much welcomed. But the fact that we have more space for a gradual and thought-through process doesn't change the fact that for many, many countries, in a cumulative sense, there will be a very large fiscal consolidation effort required. So for many countries, you might, when you add it up, fiscal consolidation, 3, 4, even 5 percentage points of GDP will be required. It can be phased over 4 and up to 7 years, but it will still have to be done. And it will have to be done against a very challenging background. Now, we have seen already in our latest economic forecast published 10 days ago, higher interest rates are feeding into the servicing costs. So this is already having an impact. I think the effects of higher inflation have not fully impacted yet on public expenditures. There will be public sector wage negotiations and rounds coming up in many countries in the coming years, and you can expect that people will want to, let's say, recover some of the lost wages. And then on top of that, there's all the additional investment needs that Pierre mentioned. And of course, in many countries, there is a need for additional spending on defense and security. So frankly, just one of the biggest risks I see is this is hard. This is going to require a very significant and sustained fiscal consolidation effort. It's not going to be easy. Okay, the second main novelty is to try to establish this as a genuine medium-term plan, where member states enter into firm commitments over 4 and up to 7 years and stick to them over that period. Now, we have tried that before, and it didn't really work very well. What we had was a constant updating of the medium-term plans in every year, so they essentially were just annual updates. Now, there is a big difference between the submission and adoption of a medium-term plan with commitments and actually turning it into a genuine reality where one implements, where one actually sticks to the commitments. There is always a risk or a temptation to reopen. On top of that, it will require in some member states some adaptation to their national fiscal frameworks, and that will not necessarily be easy in countries with federalized structures where subcentral authorities have managed a large share of spending. Third, I think, area to watch out for is complexity. Now, our initial proposal from the Commission, this was one of our core objectives, and there was some progress because we're moving towards focusing on one operational indicator, namely the growth in net primary expenditure. But to be honest, the final outcome is complex. And there are a lot of moving parts that remain when it comes to the definition of the medium-term path, the consolidation path, and in terms of the annual monitoring of that. So for example, when defining the medium-term path, we look at debt sustainability, which is based on many assumptions, growth, interest, etc. There is also room to take on board contributions or suggestions from the member state to deviate from what the technical trajectory the Commission will submit on the basis of the impact of structural reforms, which again requires a lot of analysis. And when it comes to the annual monitoring of whether targets have been respected or not, that will look at, as I said, net primary expenditure growth, which means we have to net out the impact of discretionary revenue measures. So what is included or not as a discretionary measure in its quantification becomes a very, very important part of the fiscal system. Now, all of these elements that I've described, it's very important, of course, that the fiscal trajectories are set on a transparent and rigorous basis. But complexity comes with risks, because there is a tendency to start chipping away at each and every single assumption, and it all tends to go in one direction, which is to lower the fiscal consolidation effort required. So I think it will require discipline on the part of policymakers in the Commission and also at member state level not to go down that road and to avoid the super complexity which the previous iteration of the framework had. Just on investment, just to close up, I think it's a better framework for handling investment compared to what we had before. A core part of every single plan will be for member states to present their public investment plans over that period and how they will be consistent and support the common union priorities of tackling climate change. Also, defense spending, it's possible to set this out. There will be an additional safeguard. Now, for member states that opt to have an extended period, the more gradual fiscal consolidation path leaves room for supporting higher levels of public investment. There is room to, as I say, deviate from the path suggested by the Commission, for example, to take into account the timing of important national public expenditures. And that could be important for a country like Italy, which has taken out a lot of ORF loans, which need to be absorbed in the near future. And then there is a final safeguard where, for countries which opt for an extension, there will be a check to make sure that they maintain the level of nationally financed public investment over the course of that period compared to the pre-COVID, or sorry, the period beforehand. So I think there are a lot of safeguards in there, but I want to come back. It will be a challenge to support levels of public investments in the face of consolidation. Maybe just one final remark.
Yes.
There will be, one element is there are still very, very important transfers from the ORF grants, which will still be coming in the coming years. Depending on the country, these will be of a macro scale. So, some countries will be getting 1% of GDP plus in terms of these grant transfers in the coming, up to the end of 2026. So, at least for the opening period, there is let's say, a significant, significant fiscal support coming from the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So from what you say, I understand there might be a bit more room for investment. One problem that I see is that the old EDP might start biting, forcing countries into consolidation, and then when you have the urgency to consolidate, public investment is the first chapter that is being retrenched, just because from a political economy perspective, there's no constituency that is supporting public investment whose benefits are largely diffused. But that's my own reasoning about whether we are going into a sort of public underinvestment trap or not. I would like at this point to bring in Florence, if she's online, to indeed discuss whether the reform of the Stability Pact has been maybe a missed opportunity, or if you think that the changes, especially the medium-term approach, would eventually leave more space for public investment.
Thank you. Thank you, Benedicta, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, even if only remotely. First, I think we should congratulate Pierre and Declan. Pierre, because now Luxembourg is pro-common borrowing, which I think is nice to hear, and Declan, because he's managed to make 27 EU finance ministers agreeing on something, which is also a commendable achievement. But then I think, I think in reality, the reform which has been done in a way for yesterday's world, not the one we're living in today, and we might need more. Look at what's been happening with the reaction to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It's been rapid. The same for the Inflation Reduction Act or for energy changes, and the EU has managed to leverage on existing instruments and policies, and I think the speed has been somewhat impressive, but it has been very limited in scope when you look at it. Because of the existing financial and governance constraints. What we've done in practice is to redirect a few billions out of the EU budget to seed defense industry, industrial policy, support to Ukraine and Moldova, after more were directed to the green transition industry and ensuring energy security. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the financing for defense, for the energy transition, green industrial policy, when you look at it, remains at the national level and in a way ignores the value added which would be created by EU intervention of common interest. So there has been changes in spirit, I think, but they fall short of what we need in practice. And let me share with you why I believe that's the case. It's because our EU economic governance framework is still focusing on preserving the euro and some financial solidarity, but it's not on investing in security. When you look at the current framework, it relies on two pillars: national fiscal rules to ensure the stability of our common currency, and a small EU budget, which is mostly designed to ensure cohesion across EU regions. Because budgetary rules have been thought solely to protect the stability of the common currency by preventing, in effect, something Declan was mentioning, or you, Benedict, by preventing excessive consumption spending and keeping interest rates in check. And this is why we have an EU budget which is mostly dedicated to agriculture and cohesion policy, with the idea of promoting some gradual convergence across countries. But when we look at the future transformation of the EU, enlargement, defense security, faster energy policy, artificial intelligence, and digital transition, all this, I think, we cannot do without a complete upheaval of these policies. And with the existing framework, we're trying to use it for too many investment objectives. What we need, what we have to do is to morph the EU fiscal framework of national fiscal rules and a small EU budget into something that would be a true EU fiscal policy with less of a role for national fiscal policy. And Next Generation EU and SURE, which have been mentioned by Pierre, were indeed game changer, but they should be renewed and revamped and extended. And here, because I'm French, you're all thinking that I'm trying to dodge the national adjustment, but no, I think we can make tighter national fiscal rules if we do a larger EU fiscal policy. And of course, that means thinking about financing, including own resources. And I think here we've not been creative enough, but perhaps the increasing amount of tariff across the world will help us. But I'm also thinking about indebtedness, as has been mentioned. And finally, the governance, which will be super important. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. Maybe I'll move to Atanas. We understand that fiscal consolidation needs putting pressure on governments, and public investment is likely to be cut, so we need to move to a different level. What's your perception of the role of Next Generation EU in particular? Because I would see that the substitution between national fiscal rules, like Laurence was saying, and a shock-absorbing capacity that is delivered at EU level.
Thank you very much. It's amazing to be at this wonderful event, and thanks for the UI for hosting it. So let me start there. New modes of European macroeconomic governance. It's a very good title, because indeed I think after the start of the pandemic, we switched our mentality, and this was part of the success story. I really say this, and we shouldn't be shy. I think the macroeconomic response to the pandemic was a success story. When I teach at the bachelor level my students, I tell them, think about it like this. We had an unimaginable shock. Everything was closed for months. And only a year and a half after that, we returned to potential output. This was a good response at the European level, at the national member states level. So part of this good response was the creation of Next Generation EU, I believe a very important tool, which was, I would say, it has, for me, 4 main goals. So first was keeping financial market tensions at bay. I think it succeeded in that. Second, protecting public investment. It will continue to do so even now when there would be a need for fiscal consolidation, because I agree. We did fiscal stimulus when it was needed, and maybe now there is a need for fiscal consolidation. But at the same time, as we heard, we have extreme increase in public investment needs. The world is different from what it was when we started even talking about the fiscal rules reform in 2019. The world now requires new public investment. Most of them are at the EU level. And Next Generation EU presents us with an opportunity to do that. Right now, it embeds a normative role to keep and push these public investments in the area of green and digital transition. But the world is changing, so maybe we'll have to adjust to embed also new other public investment needs, whether defense, as rightly pointed out by Laurence, or infrastructure, something that we hear a lot about, or other priorities. And fourth goal of Next Generation EU, for me, and the only one where I'm not sure will deliver, is structural reforms. So I would say the mark right now is 3.5 out of 4. Which is good, I think. You know, in the best universities in the world, like this one, you rarely get the top 100%, right? So that you can strive forward for more. So I think in that, Next Generation EU, very successful. But I will not be shy to say that there is a lot of difficulties, challenges in the implementation. Whether it is because we fixed some plans in 2021, and now we're trying to get everything done as we thought in 2021, very difficult. I saw it in my country, in Bulgaria, but I see it in other countries. And I see it in other countries that are not getting the funding, not only because they cannot do the reforms, but also because there is fatigue. There is fatigue, there is political fatigue to do this, and also maybe unacceptance of some of the reforms. And let me say it, we always talk about these days about this last mile. And we say the last mile is the hardest. I'm not even sure that is true. I have to admit I'm a bit of a failure. I never run the marathon, although I say it every year I will run it, but I never do it. But I think the hardest is somewhere in the middle. And now we are in the middle of Next Generation EU, and this is where actually countries are now facing difficulties, I think, in implementing it, because there is fatigue. So here we'll have to find flexibility, I think. So far, it was a big success, but for it to be a success, we'll have to find a way between
let us talk
delivery.
Maybe later about the governance setup of maybe a future. I understand there's little political will, but there might be something along the lines. I would like to bring back in Pierre. So we talked about the national level, fiscal spaces at the national level. Let's move everything to the European level. There's an intermediate level, which is the intergovernmental level. So what can an intergovernmental institution like the ESM do to at least accommodate part of the financing needs that Europe has at present?
I think it is important, thank you for Benedicta for the question, important to understand the ESM was set up to preserve the financial stability of the euro area and has been successful in that, supporting 5 countries that needed it. What we have seen now is that whilst the crisis we had in 2010 were partly also homegrown, that what we're facing now is external shocks. So that are nobody's fault, be it war in Ukraine, terrible aggression to that country by Russia on the one hand, or the virus. So external shocks who create problems to everyone. So what we need to look into is there risks of destabilization of the financial system? Are there countries who have a risk of financial instability? That's our core business. Now, let me also remind that there are 20 countries in the ESM, so it's intergovernmental. It's those countries that have the euro, and hopefully Bulgaria will soon join, will be 21. And obviously there's many calls. I mentioned what was said. Maybe I will say a few words on the proposal that Enrico Letta has made in his report, and which he talked about having a single market that is more than just a market, hinting at solidarity. So when we had this decision on the 9th of April, that was possible to get a consensus between the 20 member countries of the euro area to have a financial instrument which was called Pandemic Crisis Support, for which 240 billion which is nearly half of the firepower of the ESM, was earmarked. Why was that done? Well, because we had a lockdown of our economies, all our economies, and we were afraid that many countries would have real high risks of financial instability. So consensus was built around that idea. It was never used because there were lots of other instruments available, but it was important that it was there because it reassured the markets. This being said, Enrico Letta now suggests that we should consider to replicate such an instrument for financing defense expenditure. So what needs to be done then, if such an instrument needs to be installed, we need to build consensus around that idea because it is a new instrument, and we need to prove that there is a potential risk of financial instability in the ESM to do that, to be able to justify such an instrument. So we have a treaty which has those remits, and last but not least, the ESM can only support member countries. It cannot support third countries. So I think the idea of Enrico Letta is interesting, and I'm sure many countries are going to pick it up, and we're going to have our annual meeting on the 20th of June, where we will also have a review of all the instruments of the ESM, which has been asked by the member countries. So it will be a good opportunity probably to start to reflect if this is a road that 20 countries could agree to.
I'll jump in with a naughty question. Why do you think that member countries do not tap the ESM in the case of the pandemic crisis support, and what conditions need to be in place for them to tap it for defense spending, where financial instability is not necessarily an objective at that point?
Well, I think the easiest answer to why it was not tapped is that you had NGEU available, where half of it is grants and not loans, so you don't have to repay them. The second one is we still had very low interest rates at the time, nearly zero. So as rightly said by Atanas, NGEU and all the measures, sure, and all the things that were decided calmed down financial markets. It was easy for all the countries to access capital markets, so there was no necessity, no need. One has to recognize that also, if you have other ways, why would you go to the ESM, where normally the program comes, it always comes with some conditionality, but in the case of the pandemic crisis support, the conditionality was reduced to the fact that you would use the instrument, you would use the amounts of money that you would get for health measures. So this was a new type of instrument, but there was also, I think, in the back of the mind, and maybe also clearly said, that this lockdown of the economy was potentially a risk for financial stability. So this is always the key criteria. And let me finish maybe just that people have a clear picture. The ESM is not there to support projects. Different from the European Investment Bank, different from NGEU, the Commission. So it is an instrument that comes in situations that are extreme. Now, obviously, the war that is at our doorstep is considered by many an extreme risk, which, and in fact, Enrico Letta mentions that all the countries need to get at least 2% of expenditure in defense, which many are not yet doing, and that's a huge amount of money, knowing that there is very little room of maneuver in many national budgets, point number one, and knowing that the numbers or the amounts that you need to mobilize are huge, and that we have accumulated high debt in countries because of the pandemic, you see that this equation is a complicated one.
Thank you. So the ESM is a possibility. Let us move back to the EU level. Declan, what's the experience from the Commission's perspective on next generation EU, and do you think that the EU budget has an unexplored potential, and in what direction, if yes?
No, thanks. So first thanks to Atanas. I'll take 3.5 out of 4 as an assessment. Look, I actually agree a lot with what Laurence said about the potential contribution of centralizing some, let's say, funding for, let's say, European public goods defined in a broad sense at European level as a complement to help fiscal consolidation efforts. And so I think there is a very strong case to keep and to have a permanent, I'm going to call it an RRF type instrument, an instrument with the features of our RRF as part of the next as part of the next budget. Now, obviously there can be a lot of discussion on how big that should be, but the features. What features would I keep? I would definitely keep the reforms, okay? I mean, as a practitioner who's involved on a daily basis in the negotiation with member states on these reforms, I know and I observe that we make a material difference. We do move the dial. We move the dial on reforms, some of, let's say, the critical framework condition reforms which have been holding back growth in countries, like justice reform or labor market reform, in some cases pension reform. But critically, we also make reforms which are directly related to the efficiency and ability to absorb investments. So this can be everything from permitting when it comes to installation of renewable energy, auctioning when it comes to 5G networks. These are critical, so keep the reforms. The second thing I would keep is, I would keep the performance-based approach. So we disperse money not on the traditional model where we reimburse eligible costs when we get an invoice, but in terms of outcomes, targets. How many windmills have been built? How many megawatts of renewable energy have been installed? It's not a simple system, but it has two big advantages. The first big advantage is it keeps the focus on outcomes and not inputs. Okay, so the discussion is not on the process, it's on what will you achieve. The second reason for keeping it is by focusing on performance, you end up with this very intense dialogue of a policy nature between the Commission and the member state and how those investments are aligned with EU priorities. So for example, we've just finalized Repower chapters. So we were discussing a lot about investments in renewables, etc. We were also, of course, discussing reforms. But it's not a technical discussion on the technical specifications of the solar panels to be installed. It's a detailed discussion on the energy transition policy of a country. So that's why I would keep the performance. Third thing I would keep, and this is going to be controversial, keep the hard deadline. The best thing that was ever put into the ORF regulation was the 2026 deadline. Because it keeps the focus on outcomes and it prevents the constant chopping and changing of investment priorities every time there's a new government. But it's not even every time there's a new government, every time there's a new minister, every time there's a new state secretary. The investment challenges and their investment priorities do not change every 5 minutes. And a hard deadline keeps the focus on delivery. We do need to make some changes, okay? The first change, and probably the biggest thing I would regret, is we need to focus more on the administrative capacity of the country to absorb the level of resources which are available. Now, there was technical support provided, but it really wasn't of a scale compared to the amount of funding. So, so in my view, the mistake is not the 2026 deadline. Let's say maybe what happened was the amounts of funding that was actually applied for was sometimes probably in advance of what was technically capable for the country to do. So let's build the administrative capacity building into the plan itself from the outset. Second thing I would change is we need to have fewer instruments. Okay? Member states are struggling with the administrative capacity. They're blaming it a lot on the performance-based approach, and it can definitely be improved. But that's not the real problem in my view. The real problem is we're operating many different funding instruments, each with a different reporting framework, each with a different auditing approach. It is killing administrations to have to sort of try to absorb funding on a performance-based with the ORF, and at the same time trying to absorb funds on cohesion with different rules on the eligible costs. That actually brings me to maybe what Pierre was saying on potentially mobilizing the ESM resources. I fully agree with fully see the merit of making better use of the resources which are available at the ESM to fund, in this case, defense or other help, making those available to help fund European public goods. What has me slightly worried, is I come back to having a multiplicity of different instruments. We need to streamline the same instruments. We need to bring them onto a common rule book. So yes to using ESM funds, but let's try to make sure it's simple and straightforward. Maybe just by way of example, we have currently approximately 200 billion euros locked up in liquidity reserves in the ESM, the Single Resolution Fund, and the European Commission. Now, frankly, all of those have different rules on how the money can be used, the governance framework, who decides, all of this repayment. There is huge scope for synergies and bringing this into, making better use of those resources. Maybe just one final point on what changes do we need if we go forward. There has to be a much higher focus on the EU value added of the scheme, okay? The RRF, the plans are good, but they're very much nationally focused. There's very little cross-border projects, okay? And they are a bit too spread out. If we go forward, and given the scarce resources, we need to, I think, have a much higher share that would be dedicated to, let's say, true European public goods or cross-border shares. And even within national envelopes, I think we need to be much more focused on which types of investments can be eligible for funding and really focus more on what are the absolute priorities.
Thank you, Atanas. We're interested in the national perspective. So I believe you agree on the need for a permanent RRF, and in that case, how would you change the governance? You mentioned earlier it's not flexible enough. I want to add an additional element, since you come from the Southeast, which is the allocation key of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. It's probably not sufficiently recognized that it's only partly anti-cyclical. There's also distribution based on GDP per capita, which means that there is a strong redistributive component. It's not, again, only about stabilization. And that redistributive component is 70%. So where would you go in case we have a new instrument? How would you reform it? Would you also change the allocation key?
So first of all, let me say that we need a permanent RRF and next-gen EU. That's my opinion. And I really liked yesterday that Enrico Letta said that right now, maybe it seems politically impossible. This is very good because, as we know, it is impossible until it's done. So we can get there, I think. There are things to be improved. And I agree with a lot what Declan said. And however, I would start by saying the hard deadline could be an incentive, but it could also be an incentive to basically give up. This is my example of the marathon. When you know, I have another 15 kilometers and I have to run it in, 1 hour, there are some people that will give up. That's the bad case. We don't want this to happen, but we see a lot of delays. And by the way, until recently, I don't know the latest numbers, but until recently, there are some countries that were delayed in their tranches, and for some coincidence maybe, a lot of them were the frugal countries. So either no payment or one payment from the RRF. So this is, I think, a bad example, and it seems to me it will stick for the next 2 years. Flexibility. Flexibility for me is important because, as I said, things have changed. Things might have changed in terms of political priority. This is a normal part of the democratic process. In some countries, maybe in 2021, there was one kind of government. Now there is another government with different priorities. I agree that the country-specific recommendations of the Commission are normally such that are needed for the country to succeed. They are not political priorities by one party or another party or one view. They are normally reforms for growth. But of course, the political process might deem them more relevant or less relevant. And if we see the performance of countries, you will see that the best performing countries are those which have had the same government, I believe, from the start of Next-Gen EU until now. Greece, France, Spain, governments that wrote this as a reform program and are now implementing it. The switch of governments, which is a normal part of the political process, has delayed other countries in delivering as fast as they could. So my first plea is always more flexibility on the side of the Commission. But there is another approach as well, because I care about Next-Gen EU and I want it to succeed. There is another approach, which is more the stick approach. Maybe it should also be used. Right now, payments are kind of binary. You either get it or you don't get it. So there are huge delays until Commission and Member States decide, okay, you have finally delivered on all your milestones and targets, so now we are going to give you all the payment. There have been a couple of partial payments. But maybe the Commission will rethink this and start using more partial payments, saying to Member States, well, look, you only delivered 40% of what you promised, so you're only going to get 40% of the money. This will put more pressure on national governments to explain, okay, why didn't we actually deliver on everything that we have promised? And I think this might be a push for governments to actually do. And then final point is flexibility is also needed because the public investment needs have partially changed. Now we are talking about all these big EU-wide projects, cross-border projects, and we really need them. We really need it. My dream is in 10 years really not to have to come with the plane, but with the train to the State of the Union. And to do that, we need a lot of infrastructure. Infrastructure spending, either in transport, either in energy. Right now, I don't see the RRF as capable of embedding this, but we have to do it. Why? Because there is this another famous quote by Monet, we need Europe for what is essential. But the list of things that are essential have increased in the last 2 or 3 years, immensely, immensely. And this is why we'll have to deliver more on the EU level. RRF or an expanded EU budget will be the way to do so. It will create EU added value, which shows to citizens why it is important to do it at the EU level.
Thank you. The obvious issue, Laurence, is the financing of the EU budget. I understand there's no appetite for own resources at the moment. Laurence, would you have ideas about maybe restructuring the composition of the EU budget? And the second question is whether you think, this is a bit controversial, whether enlargement is a threat or an opportunity when it comes to revising the composition of the budget.
Thanks. I think the discussion's been super interesting. The first thing is, I think we need to actually move away from the current bias that we have of expressing EU-level political choice, mostly through spending and subsidies, without paying serious consideration to their financing. Because we're very good to specify spending and the amount of investment, but we have not been very good to specify what were resources, and especially own resources. I think the common theme that we are seeing on this table is common borrowing makes sense when it has to do with common public goods, which add value, and I should add to this, and can benefit several generations. We were talking about defense. I think the original idea was from Kaja Kallas, and then she moved through the east of Europe to try and convince people, and then she convinced France, Emmanuel Macron, then Enrico Letta, then Pierre Gramagna. And that is clearly an area where we have some EU value added, if only because of the sheer size of the amount needed. Energy is another one, but the one I want perhaps to spend a minute on is industrial policy. When we do it at the national level, we're creating a race for subsidies. Each country, one after the other, puts some amount of subsidy on the table in the hope of attracting an industry to his or her country and not the next one. But we shouldn't be competing within the EU like that. And we cannot actually make the best use of the money for 27 when we do this. We need to have an industrial policy which includes subsidies that is at the EU level. And the most difficult task, I think, for the Commission is in terms of allocation, so that it leverages best on everyone's capacity, but without this notion of just return, which always is very short term, because in the medium term we all benefit, and it always leads to spreading too thinly the common funding out. So how to go around this? I think it depends on the project we're looking at, but if we look at it from a bottom-up approach, like who wants to join on industrial policy, who wants to join on, I don't know, a grid for nuclear electricity that is being distributed, who wants to join for defense policy, then you can imagine a world where we have some EU funding and some national funding that would prove their commitment to this EU project. And perhaps the last, no, I think I should stop here. No, I'm taking too much time again.
Laurence, yes. Maybe we'll start collecting questions from the audience before moving back to the panelists with a more forward-looking vision. Marcello, the lady there. I'll start from...
Many thanks, Marcello Missori, Schumann Center. I really enjoyed the general message of the panel that is the European Economic Governance implemented great achievements in the last period. Nevertheless, there are current severe challenges. And from this point of view, we should fully exploit all the possibilities and in the meantime to wisely manage our constraints. And in these last respects, let me recognize that it's a good idea to fully exploit existing lending capacity. Nevertheless, I would need additional hints on the possibility that ESM offer financing to the European defense, in the sense that I guess that we share the idea that the first step in order to improve on European defense is to build a European defense industry. However, ESM cannot finance projects. So how it's possible to finance improvements in the European defense industry? This is my first question. With respect to constraints, it was recalled that technical trajectories, or better saying, reference trajectories, can be deviated by different member states. However, deviation is an ambiguous word. What does it mean? It means that it's an exceptional event, or it's the normal bargaining between the national ownership and the Commission statement, given the compliance with the various fiscal rules. And hence my question is, may I have some additional hints on this point? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The lady there, possibly short questions.
Thank you. I'm Judith Arnal from the Center for European and Policy Studies. Thank you so much for sharing your very interesting views. So I have one question for Mr. Gravegna and another one for Mr. Costello. So starting with Mr. Gravegna, I fully agree with you that we need to build on the capacities by the ESM. But at the same time, for instance, if we talk about defense, this is not only a euro area matter. This is a matter for the whole EU. So we have a legislative proposal by the European Commission dating from 2018, which basically consisted of bringing the ESM under the EU umbrella. Of course, such a proposal would merit changes, but how do you see this? What's your take on bringing the ESM under the EU umbrella? And the question for Mr. Costello, so indeed now member states by September the 20th, if I'm not mistaken, will have to present their medium-term fiscal plans. But these are going to be binding for 4 to 7 years. But if those are not agreed at national parliaments, for instance, and there's a change in government, what are the assurances that a new national government will stick to that plan? Thank you.
There's one more question here at the front, and then I'll start with the second round, if you don't mind waiting. Giancarlo?
Giancarlo Corsetti, Preventer Chair here at the EUI. The idea of assessing how the money is spent is a small, big revolution in public finance. So I would like, for Mr. Costello, whether you would comment a way to spread the practice. We fight on the budget. Once we get the money, no question asked. In a state of scarcity of resource, maybe cannot really. And the particular application is also for Mr. Pierre Gravegna, is the defense would be the ideal place. I quote Lee Buchheit, who always say that defense expenditure is the petri dish of corruption. A European initiative on how this big investment in defense will be implemented, perhaps will help European citizens to see the advantage of good practice there, right? Apart from financing, also in the procurement and the organization.
Thank you. Maybe we start from Pierre.
Yes, lots of easy questions. Thank you very much. let's start then in the order they were asked. I clearly said the ESM is not there to finance projects. We are there to ensure financial stability of the euro area and eventually prevent financial instability. That's exactly what we have, and we have instruments to do that. And what we do, we support countries. So we cannot, and I answer at the same time your question, we cannot start unless we change the treaty. I mean, if you change the treaty, you can do lots of things. If we change the treaty, you could say now you're doing defense projects. That's not what the proposal of Enrico Letta is. And that's the answer I gave. It was a general budget support, you could say, in the area of defense because there's a big need. It doesn't answer the question of having a European defense common project. That's the limits of what the ESM has. But even to do so we have a precedent, that the precedent of the pandemic where we had as a conditionality that you would use that money for health projects. It was a very general, but the idea behind it was not that the ESM would start to X-ray all the projects of the countries. So just to understand. And I would like to use this opportunity to comment on Declan, what you said. Now, we are there for financial stability. Now, the Single Resolution Fund is there for the stability of banks and the deposits of people. So you can, I think, one has to distinguish what the purpose of the institutions are, and then what can be rationalized should be rationalized. But it is clear that ESM and Single Resolution Fund, where the ESM would do also the backstop once all the countries have ratified, are very specific needs. The defense issue is a new topic that has come to the forefront, and that will make us have available huge amounts of money where very few countries know where to find that money because they don't have the room of maneuver, they don't have the buffer. And if you ask me, my personal opinion is, if the defense issues become more present, if the war in Ukraine evolves in a bad direction, if other conflicts raise, I tell you, this becomes so much the priority number one that we will have to find solutions. So we are in the phase now to think, how can this be best done? My comment to this as ESM is to say we are open for discussion, and it is up to the 20 member countries to decide if they want to replicate something similar than to the pandemic crisis support. And last question, which is quite interesting, I think in the end, at some point in time, all the countries will have the euro, and so it will be automatic. But it could be even earlier. If I take the banking union, we found solutions for the banking union, building bridges between those countries that have the euro and those who haven't. Let's be pragmatic on it. When there's a will, there's a way, but your question is very much warranted. And I hope that what we're seeing, also because of geo-economic fragmentation, that the necessity to be part of the euro area will grow over the next year. So we will have like converging forces in that direction.
Thank you, Declan.
Okay, the question on when can a member state deviate from the reference trajectory estimated by the Commission? So that process will begin on the 21st of June. So we will engage with the dialogue on a member state. And essentially, I mean, they can come forward with, I'd say, good arguments, good evidence on a number of items. They may have better data than us on recent economic developments that might change a little bit the projected or potential growth outlook. They may have enacted reforms in the recent past which are not fully factored into our, let's say, estimates of potential growth, or maybe they have a fiscal yield. That so I think as long as there's very convincing evidence, there is room to discuss these elements. And then over time, they can say they have a preference for a different profile. Our profile will be linear, just as a rule. But they may come forward to say, no, in 2025 or 26, we tend to have a much higher level of public investment because we need to absorb the RRF loans, and they have a different path of consolidation, which is non-linear. Now, that being said, and it was my part about the complexity, there's good reasons to take on board and to have that exchange. But all of those elements can also be, you can use complexity to hide, if you will, or as an excuse to basically to postpone fiscal consolidation. So it's important because you might get a better path, you might get more ownership, but it comes with risks, right?
Let me give a chance to some of the other participants there was a question there to ask the question. Yes. Is there anyone else?
Hi, thank you, Andrea Spillmeyer, Reverend Howard. Question for Declan, really, to recap where we are on the loans part, in the sense that looking forward, if not all loans are used, and maybe you can give us an idea of where we stand on that, is there a structural difference in rolling things forward with unused parts of previous amounts? You know, it goes back to the question about own resources, about the various ways of financing spending. Is that something that makes it easier, that you just say, all right, fine, we got something left, we need to find a new framework for it? Going back to the points that you made about keeping certain things, leaving others, rather than sort of, you know, creating something completely new.
Thank you. We have 1 minute because I think questions are more interesting than answers. Typically, let us hear what the lady has to ask, and then if there's no time for answers, it doesn't matter. Yes. Yeah.
I really wondered the answer, but yes. Ike Torgu, IE University Spain. I was wondering your take on how the EU 27 can agree on what exactly European public goods are, and when an emergency becomes an EU-wide crisis. Because this is like when we will decide defense is a pandemic-like crisis, for example. So I really wonder your take on that. Thank you.
Super final question there.
I make reference particularly to what Declan Costello said, and I was very much reminded of an aphorism that was used by Jean-Claude Juncker many years ago. He said, we all know what has to be done. What we don't know is how to be re-elected once we have done it. So I'm wondering how much the rise of populism, which is a failure to communicate the right policies to people and to enact reform, how much this was considered in the new European landscape.
I actually suggest, we're running out of time, that we continue the conversation in private. I just summarize, the main message. Common borrowing, I'm using Laurence's words, makes sense to finance common public goods. We are here discussing the financing side. The next step will be, for next State of the Union, once we have agreed on the financing, what about the delivery of public goods? Who's going to produce them and where? But that's for next year.
Good morning, welcome everyone, take a seat. Nice to see you here in the room, and also welcome to our online audience, as I understand it's a web stream. Welcome also to our panelists here. We are going to talk about the European election, that is a momentum for European democracy, and I would like just to start to say how important the European election is to the European integration process itself, and that we are actually lucky in the world to have this democratic movement. As a way of introduction, I'd just like to flag three issues. First of all, of course, we are going all to watch the question of the participation to the election. As we know, since 1979, we had a declining curve in terms of participation to the election. But last time, in 2019, this curve was reversed. So it's going to be extremely interesting to look at the question of participation of various groups of population, notably young people, how it's going to move. That's the first, I think, very important element. The second important point of discussion I would like to flag is how much it's going to be a European campaign versus a national campaign. So there have been a lot of discussion on that. We watched yesterday 2 debates. I watched the Spitzenkandidaten debate in Brussels, and later in the evening the French Prime Minister against the Rassemblement National, and it was actually very much showing how much there is this discussion, whether it's a European or a national campaign. And of course this campaign is going also to happen, is happening actually in a time of war. This is the first time since the direct election that we have war in the neighborhood of Europe, and this is affecting, of course, the campaign. And of course there is this issue of disinformation. And the third point I like to flag as a way of introduction is that, and it's a bit insider information from the Parliament has worked since, I would say, the last 1.5 years on a major reform, EP 2024. This reform is completed and will enter into force in July. I mention this because what does it mean? It means that the Parliament wants to reinforce its core capacities in terms of legislative power, in terms of scrutiny, in terms of budget, but also looking at external relations and a more efficient plenary. And this is important that the Parliament is able to reform itself. Why? Because it overall strengthens European democracy. So I think it's an important backdrop also for our discussion today. So now we are going to move to the presentation of the panelists. I'm going to put questions to them, so it's not going to be a succession of speeches, but rather questions. And I'd like to briefly introduce them. So starting by Micaela Del Monte. Micaela is our own EPRS colleague. She's the head of the Citizens Policies Unit. She has a decade of experience in other institutions, the Commission. She worked also in the liaison office to the US Congress in Washington. So she's very familiar with the democratic system in the US, and in the Parliament she focuses on legal and policy matters, particularly migration, asylum, and constitutional and parliamentary law. At the other end, Alexander Drexel, he's professor at the University of Lucerne. He's also here working at the EUI, a distinguished scholar in political science and political communication, and he had a prestigious academic career, including since 2019 being a full professor of political science at the University of Lucerne, and he's also the chair of the Federalism Association in Switzerland. Pascal Johanna is managing director of the Robert Schuman Foundation in Paris. She serves, overseeing strategic direction and operations there with a background of international relations. She published on EU affairs, and that's also an important role, and that's interesting in this campaign context, in being present in the media and doing quite a lot of pedagogy on Europe. And in her publication, she focuses, among many issues, on defense, women's rights, and the election. And we have another EPRS colleague, Silvia Kotanidis, who works also in the Citizen Policies Unit. She specializes in international institutional affairs, legal and constitutional aspects of EU integration, including treaty reform and enforcement of EU law. And she looks also in her research at the issues relating to the future of Europe. And I like to do a bit of self-advertising. We have outside of the room quite a few publications on of the EPRS. So we have, as you know, 1 hour and 10 minutes for this. I said I will go for questions. And I would like to start with you, Mika, about this question of the participation. As I said, we see that the curve last time was reversed, and that's a very good news. But I would like to dig in, you to dig in a little bit in this question of participation, especially young voters' participation, and if you identify different categories, you know, among also the geography of Europe, that will make a difference for this election. Over to you, Mika.
Thank you, Etienne. Yes, as you said, the last time was unprecedented peak of electors that went to elections, largely due to youth. That was reported. Now, this time for the election, there are 4 countries which will allow 16 years old to vote, and Greece 17 years old. This is a pool of 2 million voters. Whether they will turn out or not, it's of course still to be seen, but it is true that we learn the habit of voting by doing repeatedly and by starting as soon as possible. They had certainly an impact in the president election, in the way they turn out, and they use other forms of show and their willingness to participate to the political life. We remember probably the street protest led to climate change, but they also use a lot the digital tools and the social media, which is happening still again, and we can maybe discuss a little bit later, but they are not far from politics. They simply use other forms, and they take advantage of the modern tool in a way that are used. There is certainly, despite all this effort and despite the efforts of the institution, including both Parliament and the Commission, the Parliament, the European Parliament, is still a relatively old Parliament, meaning the average age of parliamentarians is around 50, 54. And this might generate what we called a gap in representation, meaning that young parliamentarians are not many in the Parliament, although there is other forms like caucuses, network of young parliamentarians. This brings me to the second category of voter, if I may say, is the women voters. In the sense, I think it's worth looking at it because the Parliament has to do much better in terms of gender representation. If you look from 79 to 2019, the Parliament has increasingly and positively so, I would say, increased the number of elected female members, which of course it goes much above the European average, and the Parliament, proudly I can say it, is doing much better than some national parliament. Now, whether this will be confirmed or not, it's again still to be seen. Some polls seem to say that for the first time ever, the percentage of female elected might be decreased, which of course might have also impact on the policy outcome, on the issue that the next parliament might tackle. And the last category of voter, I think it's worth looking at. It's the voters from the countryside, from the rural areas. There are around 30% of the voters which live in the rural areas. Last time they had an impact in the sense that post-survey analyzed how they vote, and they were broadly toward the Euroscepticism or populist parties, up to a point that we describe this phenomenon as the geography of discontent. Now, I think it's worth looking at also in view of the recent farmer protests that took over all over Europe and in Brussels too. So I think this general will be the three categories of voters.
Thank you very much, Mika, for this presentation. Just to be very clear on the question of the votes of the young people, we have now 4 countries that allow a vote below 18. Mm-hmm. And can you just...
Germany, Austria, Malta, and Belgium, and Greece 17, and Austria, yeah.
A trend in changing these rules. Now I would like to go to Sylvia, and again to stay on this question of whether it's a European campaign or an addition of national campaigns. A feature that is developing since 2 elections is the notion of Spitzenkandidaten, and we had yesterday a very interesting panel on that. We had also yesterday the Eurovision debate, as I mentioned. How do you see this working in 2024 now?
Thank you. Well, the first thing that I tend to say is that we have it, because for a longer time the European political parties were, I would say, rather silent on whether they would run it again. Probably, perhaps I use a bit of a strong word, but a bit traumatized by the result in 2019. So we started hearing about the desire, or anyway the intention to run it again, I think a bit after last summer. I find it a positive thing, personally. I find it positive for European democracy to have it a third time running. And I find it positive that there have been such debates like the one of Maastricht and the one that we watched yesterday. Now, having said that, was it perfect? Probably not. I think personally I would have some ideas or anyway some comments, some reactions to that, particularly the fact that it was basically there were less representatives of those parties that might have a different opinion on Europe, might have a different opinion on how Europe should develop. Having said that, if the question is also where lead candidate stands in the constitutional architecture, which is basically more, I would say, more objective in terms of legal research, I would say that, and we have expressed that in a study that we published last year, we asked ourselves whether the lead candidate is or has not yet or has already become a constitutional convention. Constitutional convention is a certain behavior of constitutional actors that is repeated in time and that becomes a sort of a written rule. And we reached the conclusion that so far has not, but it might become. And to do that, basically something needs to happen. There is no real silver bullet to that, because there has to be several either reforms, political maturity, institutional development of relations. So there might be a range of things that should happen for a lead candidate process to become a sort of established practice. But for sure, at least there are two things that we have analyzed, and one is, for example, the maturity of the approach to the lead candidate. So the lead candidate is not really a legal process, but it's more of a political process. That means each institution has, in a way, in few words, to come halfway. So probably European Council has to understand that it has a meaning, that there is a solid link to parliamentary electoral result. And therefore, the choice of the candidate as head of the European Executive might not be welcome to be established within closed doors, so more transparency in that respect. And from the European Parliament, and I would say not so much of European Parliament, but European political parties, there should be more of a consideration that a certain desiderata have to be fulfilled from the European Council. So ideally, and in a smart way, to make proposals as a lead candidate that cannot be refused by European Council. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is the fact that lead candidate as such, as I said before, probably there is no silver bullet, but can thrive only if there is an electoral, I would say, environment that fosters a higher level of Europeanization. That means also a higher level of and more frequent debates like the ones that we saw recently Maastricht or yesterday, a more alignment and a harmonization of, for example, the electoral ballot, the electoral campaign, the rules that govern the electoral process at European level. For doing that, either a fully fledged reform, like the one that is now being discussed at the Council level, and that was adopted by Parliament in May 2022, and this reform is fully fledged and it's quite far-reaching because it proposes the establishment of a transnational list, a union-wide constituency, and hence also the lead candidate to support this type of new system. But also, I would say, a de minimis level of harmonization and alignment of electoral rules that also the reform submitted in 2022 is proposing for the national constituency. So harmonization of electoral campaign, the voting age, all these aspects that at the moment are highly differentiated among member states and on which we have done plenty of research in the last year.
Thank you, Silvia, for that and for referring to the research. Now we'd like to turn to Pascal and to put to you, Pascal, a very blunt question, which is, you are based in Paris and you see that campaign. Would you see it as a French campaign or European campaign? What is your assessment on that? So and you're free to speak because in the EPRS, as you can notice, we are very careful with what you say as civil servants of the European Union. You are free to speak.
So I will not surprise everyone here. It is definitely a national campaign. Due to the fact that, first, there is no one European campaign. There is 27 one. Because mainly the actors are coming from the country, even if there is some people coming from the other member states. like Sandro Gozzi in France, or the national language. You have to speak the language of a country, otherwise it is not understandable for the citizen. You try to vote for. And even if the themes are European, it is always seen in a national perspective. And the political party never refer to the European parties they are affiliated in the European Parliament. And sorry for that, Sofia, they will never refer to the Spitzenkandidat of a political family. So it is very national one. In France this year, we are a particular political landscape. First of all, this EU election is typically in the middle of a second term of Emmanuel Macron. And it is the only one national scrutiny during this 5 years term. So, he couldn't run for the next time election because he has made 2 consecutive terms. So there will be a new president. And all the party have in mind, not the European election, but the next presidential election in 3 years. Okay? And it is the best occasion for this election to protest against the government for migration, for economic failing, for social pension, etc., etc. So everything is done to have a national scrutiny. Okay? So it is quite a French exception. Due to the fact also that the proportional scrutiny is not usual in France. The National Assembly, the lower chamber of the parliament, is elected at a majority scrutiny. So people in France don't have the ability, like the other member states, to use the proportional vote. And this time, they vote for like the National Assembly. And even if there is 37 lists appointed by the French authorities, and maybe only 7 or 8 will turn above the 5% thresholds we have in France to be represented in the European Parliament or at any election. The debate is focused like the second round of a presidential election. It is the fact the government election and the opposition party. And the main opposition party today is the far-right party Rassemblement National. And we have this image yesterday of a debate, you've seen and you refer on Etienne, a debate between the French Prime Minister, supporting the government, and the president of the party Rassemblement National. And it was a debate between, like a second round of a presidential election. So there is European theme, but only seen in a perspective view, and there is no European campaign, it is just a French one.
Thank you for that contribution, Pascal. I'd like to turn now to Alexander and to ask you a bit the same question. You have done quite a lot of academic research on European campaigning, and how do you see it from your perspective, Alexander?
Yes, thank you. Well, I do think that the European elections still do not lead to a proper European-wide campaign. These European elections, as important as they may be, because the parliament is important, but the elections themselves have always been considered second-order elections. As we just heard, some kind of dress rehearsal for national elections, with fringe parties usually making better results. You want to punish the actual government, you want to send a signal to your national government, etc. Low turnout. And the European Parliament elections, despite some advances on certain aspects, such as the creation of European political parties and the strengthening of those parties, the Spitzenkandidaten process and other innovations, they remain still basically very national. And this has, of course, there are not just institutional reasons for that, because they are less important than national elections, because they still do not, despite the Spitzenkandidaten process, lead to government formation. We have seen it in 2019. It's not entirely true that the people's choice has been respected. And even if the President of the Commission reflects the election result, the Commission will be a coalition of different forces, so nothing really changes much there. The European parties themselves are weak, loose federations of national parties, and the national campaigns, we will be able to talk a little bit more about that. We have now almost 300 political parties in these 27 countries that are competing and that have a fair chance of getting more than 1% of the vote. And with some very few exceptions, they are loosely linked in their programs to each other. The campaigning takes place in the national languages. Of course, voters cannot inform themselves about, or that easily at least, about the programs of political parties, the offer, if you want, in other countries. But there are also signs on the voter side that actually voters would like to go a step further and vote transnationally. But maybe we can talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I'd like to go back now to Silvia again about the frame of this campaign, whether it's European or national. And actually what you observe in your research, Silvia, is that we have, of course, a European framework, but it's also very largely national in terms of the rules that are applicable. And if you could explain a little bit.
Yes. Yes, with pleasure, because we have run quite some comparative research in the last year, and indeed one of the aspects of the lack of uniformity of electoral rules concerning the electoral campaign is quite clear. You may find also some samples of the publications that we have at the beginning of the entry of the room. But basically, we have differentiation not only concerning the electoral rights to vote and to be voted, but also, for example, how to vote from abroad, that there are totally a huge amount of differentiation. Concerning the electoral campaign, we have noticed that basically in a bunch of 10 member states, there are no specific rules on how long is the electoral campaign. Those member states that have determined the length of the electoral campaign, the time vary quite a lot. We go for example, 12 days in Portugal to almost, I think, 90 days in Czech Republic. And there is, for example, the issue of the silence, so the electoral silence, so the period in which voters are left alone with their own conscience to decide what to vote. So there are no polls, no advertisement, no canvassing, electoral canvassing. And this, we have seen that not all member states have such a silence period. Those who have normally is 24 hours before the election day and the election day. But it can be also less. For example, in Lithuania, if I'm not wrong, it's only 7 hours. And in another state, I think, as I noted down few things, Slovakia, I think, is 48 hours before election day. So you see that there is quite a lot of diversity. Electoral polls, for example, which is quite interesting, how until when can be shown the voting intentions of voters. And we see that normally this applies for almost all during the silence period, so quite little, I would say, 24 hours. But in some member states, for example, in Italy, 15 days, I think, in Cyprus, 7 days, and I think in Spain, 5 days. So we see that there are big differentiation. Now, if you allow me to spend a few words on the issue of the link to national parties, this is a political issue, but it's also a legal issue, because we have asked ourselves, is it possible that there are indeed some regulatory constraints why the logo and the name of European political parties is not so often linked to the national logo and symbol in the ballot? And here the surprise is quite high, in the sense that we saw, and we made this inquiry whether the law says it explicitly or implicitly, so it requires also a certain degree of legal interpretation of the rules. We saw that, for example, less than half of the states allow either explicitly or implicitly to link the name of and the logo of a European political party to a national one. That means that the majority of member states do not allow it, either explicitly or implicitly. So what does it mean, do not allow explicitly? We see that, for example, Belgium and Luxembourg, it's not possible to link the logo. It could be for the name. But in the other states where this is not possible, it comes from an interpretation of the legal provisions. For example, either because the elements that you can put on the symbol of the party is an exhaustive list. So if the European political party do not appear on the list, this means that they are not allowed. Or because the authorities interpret the reference in the law to the parties as to national parties. So in some other situation, for example, there is a structural element. So in some states, it is not possible at all to show the logo as such. So also for the national parties, which means that, of course, you cannot show also the logo of a European party. So these are all little elements that show that the reason why this does not happen, so the link is deeper than, it's not the only thing, of course, but it is also associated, there is also an association of a normative element. Now, if we see those member states that on the other side allow to show, there are 3 states that allow explicitly for the logo and the name. And that is very little, as we see. For other states, there is a sort of implicit interpretation, either there are guidelines, or we have contacted directly the national authorities because the law was not clear. And for example, I may refer to the fact that, for example, in Italy, the guidelines, the electoral guidelines, they explicitly say that a party can associate the name or logo to a European party, provided it has obtained the authorization from the European political party to do that. And currently there are, I think, on 42 symbols that have been deposited, 5 have a link either to the name or to the name and logo. It's a positive. For the Netherlands, for example, they told us it's a new question. So they didn't really give us a very straightforward answer, but they said for the logo, because they fear that there is a risk of confusion, they would run a sort of ad hoc exam of how it looks like, so to say. So we see that the matter is much more complex. It is political, but it is also legal.
Thank you, Sylviane. But I think on a positive note is that for the websites, actually, of the parties that benefit indirectly from the financing of the European parties, then there is an association of the European logo, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to stay a couple of minutes on this question of a European campaign and how the voters can make that choice for the campaign. And actually, I would like to turn again to Alexander, because I understand that you, Alexander, with some colleagues of the UI, you develop an app which is called EU and I 2024. And according to this app, you have like a series of questions on your preferences, environment, economy, consumers, etc., etc. And it helps you to make your choice, if I understand, at a European level for European party. It would be interesting if you could give a glance on this app, Alexander.
Yes, thank you, Etienne. Yeah. We have indeed built a voting advice application, as these applications are called. This started decades ago at the national level in the Netherlands, then it spread to Germany, Switzerland, etc. These were applications that helped finding the best matching parties to users, given their policy preferences that they have. And in 2009, we innovated here at the EUI by proposing the first transnational voting advice application in the wake of the 2009 European elections. And we have continued doing this with Professor Diego Garcia here, Dr. Lorenzo Chiki, and many other colleagues that we have now continuously done that every 5 years. And the idea is that as a voter, you may feel a bit lost in these masses of information that come your way from the campaigns, with a logo or without, and you have to somehow make a sense of those information that are coming from the parties and the candidates to make an informed choice at the polls. So what these voting advice applications do, they help you making that choice by condensing the information that is contained in the party programs, in the campaign information from the parties. And we boiled down the campaign to 30 statements on all sorts of very different policy areas. And the idea is you go online, you go to uandi.eu, you choose your country where you're voting, usually. But you can take any of the countries in the language of the country. It's also, everything is in English. And you can basically take a position on 30 statements that cover this extremely wide range of policies. And you say whether you agree or you disagree with those statements. And in the background, there are these 285 parties that we have coded their programs on those statements. And the simple algorithm then basically matches your preferences with the positions of the parties. And then there are different forms of visualization that help you understand what party comes closest to you, which one goes, is very, very out there. And this is very popular. In 2009 already we had more than 2 million people using that before the European elections. And also this year we hope that we will have a 7-figure number of users, because we're not doing this just for being good citizens of Europe. We're doing this also for research reasons above all, and we're trying to get a sense of that enormous amount of data from the political parties and from the voters that come our way. And that is, for example, it's just one of the examples of these, the effects of such voting advice applications that could be shown: better informed public, higher propensity to actually want to go to the polls and cast a ballot. These are clearly effects that have been shown by research, so something good actually for democracy. But we have also seen that there is a interest, a curiosity among the voters for programs of political parties in other countries than in the country in which they have the right to vote. Why is that? Because these transnational voting advice application, it allows you to actually match yourself with all of those parties in Europe. And you will find out that if you're voting in Portugal, maybe there's a Polish party that matches your preferences much better than the best matching party in the place where you can cast a vote. So naturally, you would be interested in actually also casting your vote for that party. And so that would then be effectively a transnational form of voting, and technology, which is both a blessing and a curse. In this case, it's probably a blessing, enables you to actually compare the party programs of the Polish parties with those in your country, say in Portugal. So with these kind of tools, one could actually go a step further and develop a completely new form of voting in European elections that would allow citizens to cast a ballot beyond the borders of their country.
Thank you, Alexander, for that. I see the applause coming. No. I wanted to mention also on the side of the European Parliament, and it has been sponsored by the EPRS, we have also an app or a website which is What Europe Does For Me. You can Google it. And it gives examples on the achievements of the European Union or the impact of the European Union on certain territories, cities, departments, and so on and so forth. And it goes quite in detail. If you look for this region, for example. And it gives also examples on certain categories of profession, hobbies, activities in life that people might have. And you can use that and create your own profile, and you have examples that are also in the 24 languages, which is quite important when we run such a campaign. It has been used already for the last election, and we are now above the 9 million single users for that, so it's quite interesting. So EU and I.EU and What Europe Does For Me, so you can have these two when you leave the room on your device. Right, time is flying, and I would like now that we move to another subject that has been quite important in the discussions already since we started the State of the Union debates. Is the question of disinformation and the campaigns, and also foreign interference. And I would like to turn to Alexander, how he sees this issue of disinformation, and especially how he sees the role of the social platform. You know, are there chance? Are they sort of threats for democracy? And if you could dig in a little bit in this subject.
Yes, thank you, Etienne. As I mentioned before, technology, and especially internet technology, is both a blessing and a curse. And regarding elections, it has in the beginning been seen as, wow, this could really help democracy work. We can modernize elections, we can vote online, we can inform ourselves online. This is all great we can deliberate online, etc. This is all great for democracy. But over time we have seen that, of course, information being an extremely important aspect of elections, you also start having misinformation, and actually strategically placed misinformation, fake news, deepfakes, etc. Not necessarily coming from the inside of your electoral district, but even from outside, from Russia, from China, and from other places in the world. And that is, of course, extremely threatening to democracy. That's been recognized by the World Economic Forum this year. The topic of disinformation or misinformation, as you wish, as being one of the biggest risks for democracy nowadays. And so there is a real urge for debunking mechanisms to be found so that misinformation can be flagged as such and does not change political opinion formation of the voters in undesired ways. Social media, of course, have played a big role. The platforms themselves, most of them are not in the European Union, and they have their business models, and their business model is very simple. You want to attract as many people as possible on your platform. You want to keep them on your platform as long as possible, because that allows you to sell advertisement, right? And so there's a fierce battle for those market shares of these platforms. And the way they do that to maximize user engagement, keeping users and attracting new users on their platform, is they create algorithms that are personalizing the information that you're seeing. If you read the newspapers, most of the newspaper portals are using these techniques as well. So you see actually content that you like to see, because that makes you want to keep on that page and go on. But then you get into a bit of a bubble. That's an old theory, that you go into some kind of opinion bubble. You're surrounded by like-minded people. You only see arguments that are similar to yours. You can maybe even radicalize over time. And that will be, of course, very bad for dialogue, for debate, for democracy in general. So what do? We should find maybe ways to change those personalizing algorithms, but they're not in our hands. They're in the hands of the platforms, of private businesses. And even if you want to do research on the effects of personalizing algorithm in democratic campaigns, it's very difficult, because the platforms don't give you access to the holy grail of their business model, which is the algorithm themselves. And I can tell you, the TikTok algorithm probably knows you better than you do yourself. So there's no way you can access those algorithms and do research with them. So you have to create it yourself. You have to find other ways to show actually the potentially extremely detrimental effect of such algorithms in the field of public opinion formation and in democracy. And I do think this is a huge problem. And we will see. I don't think that regulation on its own will help solve that problem.
And see that, and I'm sure this question will be raised this afternoon. Also, we have our Director General for Communications of the Parliament that will speak this afternoon in town. Mika, I would just want you to react on this if you wish, so on the question of disinformation, and in particular, if you think it affects particularly young people, and if there is a particular relation with young people.
Well, it is affect young people. Alexander mentioned one of the social media, TikTok, which has reported to be particularly used, not anymore Facebook, but TikTok. So it's affect not only the young people, but also the way political parties do campaign. It is reported that those young voters, of course, they use not only to organize mass tweeting, organize themselves, but also to inform themselves. So we are far from the traditional source of information. And the risk, as Alexander has said, that is not only disinformation, so deepfake or misleading information, is that the risk is the discourse or the political narrative becomes so polarized, so divergent, that people go to the ballot and they see the European election as a binary choice. Either you are pro-European or you are against the European project, like it was a kind of referendum, which is far from being the case, because if we look at the European Parliament, there are 7 political groups which collect, I think, more than 200 national political parties, which means that the plethora of choice that you have when you go to the ballot, it's almost infinite, if I may say so. So it's also interesting. The website, it was mentioned because it gives the opportunity to understand whether there are other political ideas that are similar or different to yours, and to see, in fact, that you might have transnational topic, or to see that when you talk about migration, even in a national debate, when you talk about Russia, Ukraine, when you talk about farmer protest, you have national actors discussing topics that are European topics that will be discussed, debated, and dealt by the European Parliament, Council, but European actors. So it's also misleading, I think, to pass the message that it's persistently a second-order elections, because there are very few today, the topics that are purely and strictly national, besides the Macron issue.
Agree.
There is many issues, they are so interlinked that, in fact, when you are expressing or looking at the national position, you are indirectly looking at what's happening in Europe.
Thank you, Mika. Time is running, so a question to Pascal now. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be in the middle of the election. It starts on Thursday, it ends on Sunday, and then we have the results. And then we have 5 weeks. And during these 5 weeks, there are meetings of the political groups in Brussels. So I would like to ask you, Pascal, to from your perception, again, with your freedom from the Schuman Foundation, how you see the future parliament, possible new alliances, groups, etc., if you can share what you think about it.
Thank you, Etienne. Yes, I can refer, and you could find the study, the complete study on the website of the Robert Schuman Foundation in French and English. We are a network, and we make working works on the 27 countries, because, like I said, there is 27 election. Even if there is the expectation of a rise of radical rights party, for us, it will be a wave, not a tsunami. First of all, because the radical rights are not united and divided. The objective of the ECR and the ID party are not the same. The ECR is running by, we are in Italy, by the President of the Council of Italy and Giorgia Meloni, who is running at this election, just to be sure that she could be, maybe, the first political party after the election, dethroning Renew, because she expected, with Fratelli d'Italia, to be the highest delegation in this group. Today it is the Polish one. And she expects to make, like she succeeded to do in Italy, a coalition of the center-right, with quote, that is to say, she has Fratelli d'Italia, ECR, Forza Italia, EPP, and Lega ID. But it's not shared by all the members of the ECR party. And if you look at Poland, the tension between the government and the former government, the peace, law and justice, and Tusk, it's also that they share the same ideas, you know. So she will try to do that, and she expects to be at the table of a negotiation, okay? But this ECR party are pro-Ukraine, and it is the main difference with the IDs party, whose main delegation is an Italian one today, the Lega, but the Lega will make a low score this time, and will not, and with a big lose of members from Italy in this group, and of course, everybody show or look at what will happen in France, because we see that the survey poll show a very high score for Rassemblement National, a very high score. But if you look at this party, the main things they are in common are they are more pro-Putin and pro-Russia, and I call that Putin's puppet, okay? So, and it is not like Giorgia Meloni, we has support Ukraine till the beginning. So it is one of the divisions. There is also another one. Of course, there was, in the recent days, some divorce inside the ID's party, because they exclude the German party, AfD, because this party is going too far right. And for the Rassemblement National, who is coming from the same side from the AfD today, when the father of Marine Le Pen was running the party, she tried to make the party more respectable. And she tried to do that because she wanted to succeed on the first time she wanted to run next time for the presidential to be elected. So she cut the link with the AfD, with so far rightist. And so there will be a lose from this party, and she will not expect to have the same guys as she expects, because the lose of the AfD and the lose of the Lega will not be gained by even the Dutch or the French or the Austrian or Belgium new members. And there will be also the problem of a non-attached group, where today the main delegation is Italian, the Cinque Stelle movement, but the second one is the Fidesz. The Fidesz, I remind, in 2019 was elected with the EPP family, and they get rid of that on 2021. But who will want Orban? Orban, who was on the main family till he joined the EU, did he knock at the ID group because he's more pro-Putin, or did he knock to the ECR? He did that, but for the moment and before the election, Meloni said, no, I don't want you inside. And of course, if we look at all the over 27 member states who will have election, we see that in a lot of countries, and the more population, Germany, Spain, Poland, there will be the main party will be the EPP one. And for us and for the network, we say that probably, and maybe surely, the EPP will remain the first group in the next election, followed by the socialist one. And they will make a score that more than 100 MEPs. They are the only one to do that. Renew succeeded 5 years ago, but maybe not this time because of the survey poll in France and the lack of delegation they will have next time. And because of the division of the ECR, even if we spoke a lot of a reunification, not now, maybe not today, maybe later, but not now. The political evolution of this political party are not able right now, and will take time to share new things. And the division Russia-Ukraine is a very important one. So maybe my conclusion is that the next majority in the European Parliament after the June election will be the same one as the outgoing one.
Thank you, Pascal, for that presentation. You mentioned the majority. I'd just like, before we move to the Q&A, that if Mika could just make a little recall on this question of the absolute majorities in the parliament, where we show that actually on the big files we have a cooperation between Socialist, EPP, and Renew.
Yes, there are a number of consequential votes for which the absolutely majority is required. I think that the immediate next one will be the election of the Commission President. In addition, it's also a secret ballot, so it's not immediate that all the members of Parliament will follow the party line. And indeed, if we look at last election in 2019, the current president won with a very slim majority, 9 votes. But there's many other files in the multi-annual financial program, in the second reading of the ordinary legislative procedure, I think also enlargement to the new country. And I think, if I may add just another element to what Pascal said in terms of uncertainty when it comes to the next parliament, it's very common for the European Parliament to have a large turnover amongst members. Last time, almost 60% of members were new, which means that when they join the Parliament, they have to learn how the machine works, how the Parliament works, and it will require a certain investment of time, also to understand not only in which part they belong, but also how they will address the different topics. And there were some delegation last time in Slovakia, they were completely, totally, 12 out of 14, totally new. So they will have to face a steep learning curve when they arrive.
Thank you very much, Mika. Thank you to all panelists. So with this, we have come to the end of the first part, which is namely the presentations and the questions and the presentations by the panelists. And now we open for questions, and I will take like 3 questions and then make a round of response. And the gentleman in the front first. And there are microphones.
Thank you very much. And I'm Flavio Brugnoli, I'm the director of the Centro Studi sul Federalismo in Turin, in Italy. And in Italy, some commentators and scholars use the definition Euro-national campaign. I mean, it's so, as it was mentioned, it's so closely interlinked that it would be naive, in my opinion, to imagine to have either or a national European campaign. And this is a success story for Europe, because interdependency is the key word for the European Union, in my opinion. And we have plenty of examples of it. You mentioned the Bardella-Attal debate or match, and I didn't see, but I have read that they clashed on Europe Federal, the Federation of Nation States proposed by some decades ago by Delors. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni is asked, do you like more Emmanuel Macron or Viktor Orban? And yesterday, some socialist leaders signed a joint declaration opposing the far right, etc., etc. You have, I mean, plenty of examples of this interdependency between the national and the European level. Obviously, everything is imperfect, but democracy is imperfect. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question or remark? Yes, the gentleman in the back and then the lady in the front.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Ataman Sari. I'm from Italian PR. So my question is that because we see the data, the recent data and the information from the Freedom House report and also the Videm Institute, we see that democracy is not doing well. And we have still again the sequential decline of the democracy, especially the liberal democracy. I wanted to know how it's going to be the impacts of the rise of illiberal democracies in the Europe on the mindset of the young generation to vote for the European election. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kata Moravec. I'm a PhD candidate at Central European University. And my question is more hypothetical. It concerns the cross-national lists or European lists. So ideally what we would like to see if we were to introduce this system successfully is voters still showing up and then voting on more European dimensions of policy ideally. But what my question is don't you think that it might be the problem that most of the things based on which people traditionally vote, like clue-taking, partisanship, politician recognition, whatsoever, will largely be gone or at least mitigated by this new system of elections? So do you think there would be, if we were to introduce this cross-national list, a drop in turnout? And if so, do you think it could be overcome in a couple of electoral cycles, or this would be a prevailing problem if we were to introduce a European system?
Thank you. Let's take another one. Yes, Gabi, please.
Thanks a lot. Gabi Umbach. I'm leading the research area Knowledge Governance Transformation at the Robert Schuman Center, and I'm also a visiting fellow to EPRS. Thank you very much for the panel, for every one of you, for the very interesting contributions. I want to bring us back to a governance question and to something that we potentially saw starting yesterday evening, so to the lead candidate procedure. We saw it as an innovation in governance, while it has proven to be a bit of still experimental governance in the making, so working out in 14, failing in 19, now in 24 being so far on track to deliver. So the political parties propose candidates, we have a lot of candidates, visibility, and the debates are going on. As Pascal, as you said, also being linked to national campaigns, to national political parties. With now France stepping up to support Draghi for a top job, presumably meaning the top job, if we look into the stances on fiscal policy and on investment, we come into a moment where a non-aligned, a non-party aligned candidate who's supported by a big nation in Europe faces the problem of national nomination by a government that might not have chosen him in the first place, to run for a job that he wasn't designated by the European party. So if we look now at the potential fate of the future of the procedure, do you think I think there are three trajectories. Retirement of the procedure, integrating as a type of political folkloristic ornament of parliamentary democracy on the elections, or further formalization, further constitutionalization of the procedure to really give it a European spin and to underline parliamentary democracy in the elections. And this is to all of the panelists, but maybe, Silvia, you, based on your legal constitutional expertise, I would be very interested in your educated and informed perspective on the future of the procedure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabi. And I think we stop here. We have already a lot of issues. And from the future of the Spitzenkandidaten to the sort of positive reading of Euronational campaign going on as something complementary, was mentioned also the choice of voters and decline of democracy and the rise of illiberal democracies in Europe and the effects of young people. Who wants to react on that? Silvia?
Perhaps I start. Actually, I laughed because yesterday someone named the lead candidate at Zombie, was the panelist next to me. Well, what happens if it fails? Actually, I don't know, but perhaps I'm too optimist. I don't find that another candidate that is not a lead candidate necessarily makes the lead candidate process fail. But perhaps I'm too optimist on that. I think that the lead candidate, I think that also into national politics, it can happen that, you go to vote, there are coalitions, they, in theory, assign someone, or they choose their lead candidate, but then, depending on the electoral result, depending on many factors, the thing can change. So, I don't consider the lead candidate a legal process, a formula. I consider it a process, a political process which is subject to unexpected events. This is about the zombification of the lead candidate. On the question of the formalization, which is, I think, a more, I would say, legal question. In fact, I don't think that the formalization in the Constitution or in the treaties is a good idea, and I don't say it because it's my own opinion, but because we did a comparative research, to see how member states regulate the issue of the nomination of the head of the government. And because de facto this is what we are talking about. So it's a sort of process that leads to the choice of the head of the executive, in this case the European executive. And we saw that in the great majority of member states, this is left to a sort of a constitutional etiquette. So a constitution, what we call constitutional convention. So we have situations where in the great majority of states there is nothing. So there have been, for example, in Belgium, there is the tradition of the formateur. In the Netherlands, there is the formateur and informateur. So there are different figures, different roles that in a way lead to the fact that after consultations with certain political actors, then it is reached the decision. In Italy as well, for example. In few member states, there is a sort of formalization of who should be consulted, but not how or who gets the post, basically. In a very few, I think in a bunch of 2 or 3 states, namely Greece, Bulgaria, if I'm not wrong, but you find this comparative study in the study that you find the copy in the room. Basically, in only 2 or 3 states, it is sort of formalized. So that means that if we want to reflect at European level what is the legal practice at national level, in my opinion, that leads to a clear answer that it is not necessary. Also because the fact that there is a constitutional convention, so a behavior, leads to more flexibility to the process. If you formalize it, it is more, it is more formal, and then it is a kind of shirt, too tight, can become too tight shirt, because in principle treaties are meant to survive a longer time, so they cannot be modified all the time. So there should be found a flexible way to regulate this process.
Alexander?
Yeah, just maybe on this, I mean, we have had now 45 years of democratic elections of the European Parliament, but politics is about power. Why would it be in the interest of heads of state to further give a democratic legitimacy to the government formation process at the European level? Why really do that? They would lose a little bit of their power. Why make transnational electoral wards become a reality? They would lose national seats in the parliament for this pan-European ballot, and then you lose control over that, right? And so maybe it took so long, and it will continue to take very long until we have that kind of furthering of democratic legitimacy, just because I don't think the heads of state really want to give away the very direct democratic legitimacy that they enjoy.
Pascal, a quick comment, yes.
On the first question, you spoke about Euro-nationalized campaign in Italy. Yes, but when we see another example, Giorgia Meloni versus Orban, they are not so good friends because migration, who is a typical example of what can be done at European level, Giorgia Meloni thinks, and I'm sure she's right, that Orban is not very good friends because she refused to take his part of solidarity of the migration that Italy has to accept because of the first entry country. And on the other side of the pot, the Europe Fédérale. Europe Fédérale was never mentioned in the Robert Schuman Declaration on the 9 May 1950. Never. He said step by step, solidarity, and we go further and further, not federal steps. And if you look at Jordan Bardella, who fear the restriction of France will lose power because of a federal issue. A president, our former president, Marine Le Pen, who was against Euro, decided not to go back because France are against. And what is the main federalist policy than the ECB? So federalist, one time he said no, and sometimes he accepts that. So it's crazy, but it is, like I said, the French exception. We have a presidential election, and we are already in that election, not in the European one.
Thank you, Mika. You want to react also very quickly?
Yes, on the transnational interlinked topics, it is indeed, it exists. For me, the problem is that the voters do not receive enough information, and the ballot paper is one element, one example, but also in campaigning, it's very hardly seen or hardly heard saying which European political party, the national political party, will or possibly adhere in the next election. And on the lead candidate or the zombie project, like it was said, I think there is, as Silvia said, that the role of constitutional convention and practice, it's very important when it comes to any constitutional setting. If we look at the parliament, there is written nowhere that the commission should go and face a hearing. In fact, the candidate commission should face the parliament before being elected as a college. Nevertheless, there is, I think today, no one single commission that will dare to think to be nominated or even elected without being grilled for 3 or 4 hours in the face of a committees. This has become over the years a standard practice. It's probably the highlight of the parliament, I would say, at the beginning of the legislature. So I think that we have to give the process a little bit of time, and it might work in some years.
Thank you, Mika. And indeed, the moment of the hearings in Europe, the confirmation hearings as they are called now in the new rules, it's going to be something to watch, as I think very important for European democracy. One question, if there is one more question, final one. No, it's not the case. Any final comments on the side of the speakers? Not the case either, so I would like to thank them. I would like to thank them for their contributions. It has been a great debate, great discussion. Follow us also online, our various resources online. I wish you a good day, and thank you very much.
And go to vote.
And go to vote.